Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Josiah and Tabitha, Western Historical Romance by Emma Morgan. Chapter 1. The Unpleasant Truth. Lucia, I can peel the orange by myself. Tabitha Kidman was struggling not to let her irritation show as she looked at the woman who was standing beside the small table in her bedroom. I'm a grown woman. In case you haven't noticed, she struck her open palm on top of the table. Like every other piece of furniture in her bedroom, the table was painted sky blue because Tabby didn't like pink. Her mother had tried to persuade her to have her bedroom decorated in pink because that was the color that was acceptable for girls. But she had stubbornly insisted on blue, and in the end, her mother left her to do pretty much as she liked with her bedroom. Lucia, the Negro maid, just smiled at her mistress, pretending not to notice her irritation. She'd been taking care of Tabby from when she was just 2 years old, and this was her baby, even though only 12 years separated their ages. Having been brought into the household under the guise of being a companion to Tabby, she'd started working as a personal maid from then. Giving her mistress an indulgent smile, Lucia leaned forward and pushed the plate towards her. "Miss Tabby, frowning will make you grow old faster, and throwing a tantrum is considered very childish. If you continue sulking whenever things don't go your way, no one will ever take you seriously but will still treat you like a child. Besides, you always say that peeling fruit with your nails causes your skin to get chapped. We don't want that happening now, do we?" Tabby didn't have a rejoinder for, indeed she had said that before, but things had changed now, and it was time for her to start taking care of herself. Life wasn't going to continue the way it had been before, and she wanted to believe that she had changed, or she was in the process of doing so. No more servants taking care of or fussing over her anymore. She was a changed person, and the sooner everyone knew that, the better for her and them. Of course, in the past, she had allowed the servants to cater to her every need, because as the only child of her parents, she was loved. Too much that she now wondered how she had let things go this far. She guiltily admitted that she had enjoyed being treated like a princess in the past, but not anymore. It was quite suffocating now that she'd taken a good look at her life, found it wanting, and then she decided she just couldn't stand all that pampering anymore. But reacting angrily and throwing tantrums would only make those around her think that she was still a child, as Lucia had said, and continue treating her as such. "Lucia," she said, struggling with control. Patting the place on the bed next to her, she smiled at her maid. "Please sit down." "Why, Miss Tabby? Did I do something wrong?" Tabby shook her head. "No, but it's time that you and I had a really serious talk." In the Kidman household, servants were never allowed to sit in the presence of their masters, and especially not the Negroes. It was something that greatly troubled Tabby, but rules in her parents' house had to be followed. "Please sit down." But Lucia just stood there staring at her mistress. "I said sit down, Lucia." Tabby's tone was firm. "Or do you want to be considered as being rude to your mistress now?" Lucia wrung her plump fingers, and Tabby felt sorry for her. She knew that the poor woman was torn between obeying her and having her salary deducted because she sat down in her presence. "Never mind. You can stand." Tabby saw Lucia sigh in relief. "But all this fuss has got to stop. I'm now 21, and it's about time that I started doing things for myself." "But, Miss..." "Lucia, I didn't ask you to speak, so hold your peace. You've been a wonderful friend and companion, but I don't think I'll be needing your services anymore." "What? Why?" The woman got so agitated that Tabby had to stand up and walk to her. "What wrong have I done, Miss Tabby? Please just flog me and let it be over with, but don't ask me to leave." Tears filled her eyes. "Lucia, calm down. Why would anyone flog you?" Her words troubled Tabby. She didn't want to believe that any of the servants in their household were mistreated or flogged, but she'd always turned a blind eye to everything that was going on, so why should she be surprised if servants were still flogged? The Civil War had been fought to ban slavery and the mistreatment of Negroes, for crying out loud. Was her family as bad as the slave masters in the South? Lucia put a hand to her mouth. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that." "Lucia?" Tabby held her by the shoulders and looked into her eyes. "Tell me the truth. Have you ever been flogged while working in this house?"
The maid shook her head, but averted her eyes.
"I'm not going to get you into any kind of trouble. All I want to know is whether anyone has ever hit you for any reason." "Miss Tabby, please leave matters be," the woman said, fresh tears filling her eyes. "But please don't ask me to leave. Where will I go? And this is the only home I have ever known from when I was 12 and came here to look after you." "I'm not asking you to leave. It's only that I don't need you picking up after me and all. Of course, you'll still do one or two things for me, but not everything as before. What if your mother gets to know of it? She will immediately relieve me of my duties. Then what will happen to me?" "Oh, Miss Tabby, if I've offended you, please forgive me, but don't stop me from taking care of you." Tabby wanted to say more, but from Lucia's fearful expression, she knew nothing much would be resolved. She would deal with her maid later when the woman was calm. Right now, she was too agitated to understand that Tabby's intentions were for the good of both of them. "Lucia, could you please get me my walking shoes and parasol? I need to go out briefly." "Yes, my lady." The woman looked like she wanted to say something more, but held her tongue and went to do as bid. Tabby walked aimlessly in the park, pausing from time to time to listen to the children's laughter that made her smile. "Oh, to be young again," she thought, "and free of the cares of this world." Sneaking out of the house without any of the servants following her had been difficult to say the least. Lucia seemed to dog her every footstep and didn't seem to want to let Tabby out of her sight. But she had managed to get away and felt a little victorious. Who ever knew that she, Tabitha Dorcas Kidman, daughter of Arthur and May Kidman, one of the wealthiest couples in Ridgeway, Vermont, would be walking aimlessly in the park on a bright spring morning, and utterly bored out of her mind and feeling very restless about her life too. Yet here she was, wishing that she was able to ask the world to stop so she could get off. On normal days, at a time like this, she would be out shopping at any one of the new department stores that had sprung up in rapid succession over the past few months, or she would be taking mid-morning tea with a number of her friends and giggling as they discussed their future lives, which consisted of nothing more than being married to wealthy and successful men. Being like their mothers was something they all aspired to, perfect hostesses who threw great and lavish parties and balls. The ton of the ton, as one newspaper had called them. Up until a few days ago, her life had been perfect, so perfect that she'd felt like she was immortal. The world bowed down to Tabitha Kidman, and her every wish was someone else's command. Invincible was what she was. Now, as she thought about how foolish she'd been, she chuckled softly. "Stupid and ignorant is what I was," she muttered under her breath. There was no immortal human being, and she'd learned that the hard way. Spotting an empty bench, She hurried over to it and sat down at one end, just in case anyone else might want to use it too. The last thing she wanted was to get involved in a conversation with anyone. Let the world leave her to her misery, she thought, leaning her head back against the bench rest and closing her eyes. "Miss, are you all right?" A squeaky voice spoke from close by, and then she felt a hand on her arm. "Are you sick or something?" Tabby opened her eyes to find dark ones, observing her from the face of a little boy who couldn't be more than 7 years old.
"And you're crying. Did somebody hurt you?" He scrambled up on the bench and looked at her, and she could see the concern on his face. Such wisdom in a little one made her marvel.
"No," she laughed as she wiped her face. "Something must have fallen into my eyes." "Toby," a sharp voice called out, "are you disturbing this nice lady?" A woman of about 30 hurried over to the bench. "I'm sorry if my son was being bothersome. He tends to wander off and likes talking to strangers, thinks he's the mayor of Ridgeway or something." Her tone was dry, and she gave her son a stern look, which he ignored. It was clear to Tabby that this was something that happened often. "Not at all, Mom. He's a good little boy." "Thank you for saying that, but I have to get him back to the others. My sister and I often bring our little ones to the park to play, but this one has to be watched very keenly." She smiled, and Tabby saw where Toby got his looks from. "Toby, now get off that bench and let's get going." "Miss." He put a hand on Tabby's arm. "Jesus will make everything better. You'll see," and with a final wave, gave a whoop and rushed off to play with his friends. "You have a wonderful little boy. Take care of him." The woman left, a pleased smile on her face, her eyes following her son's progress as he ran about. Tabby could see that she was really proud of him, even though she pretended to be annoyed that he liked speaking to strangers. From out of the mouth of babes, Tabby thought. But somehow, Toby had brightened her mood, and she was going to hold on to the promise that things would be all right, even though she had no idea how that would happen.
Her friends should see her now, she thought. But then again, were those people really her friends, or had they just hung around and indulged her because of who she was? Well, she would never know now, because she'd cut off ties with them and purposed in her heart never to speak with them again. Never again would she be the gullible fool that she had been before. From now on, it would be all about looking out for herself.
"But what good will that do?" a small inner voice asked. "Clement Wagner is the darling of your parents, and in their eyes, he can do no wrong." Which was quite true of her ex-fiancé, even though he wasn't aware that their engagement, according to her, was over. Clement had been hand-picked by her father because he was of the right pedigree according to their social status. The term Ridgeway Brahmins came to mind as she borrowed the description from Boston. Her family was highly placed in the social circles of Ridgeway, and indeed Vermont, so the only daughter of Arthur Kidman had to marry someone of her own class. To the Kidmans, their future son-in-law's wealth didn't matter because they had money, a lot of it. Their only desire was to have their daughter's future secured and protected, and who better to do it than the grandson of one of the men they most respected. Clement's maternal grandfather had been a watchmaker who'd been born in Switzerland and lived there for many years and then immigrated to America. Being one of the best in his field, Frank Grumbosch was soon a household name. When his daughter and son-in-law died of tuberculosis, Clement was left in his care. He was only 10 at the time, and from that moment on, his grandfather started grooming him to take over the family business. At the time Tabby was introduced to Clement, which was about a year ago, she'd thought him so charming and handsome. She was the luckiest girl in the whole of America to have landed such a wonderful man, and when he proposed marriage, urged on by her father, She'd walked on the clouds for a long time after that. Her friends and family members envied her, and talk was that theirs would be the wedding of the year. She had thought so too until a few days ago when she found out just who or what her fiancé was up to and the real reason he wanted to marry her. As usual, Tabby had gone over to the Wagner residence to discuss further plans of their upcoming wedding. With Clement's grandfather dead, he was now the head of the family. Linda Grumbash, his grandmother, was a snobbish woman, but Tabby didn't bother much about her. After all, once she and Clement were married, they would live in her father's house, which would one day be hers. The decision had been made because the Kidman residence was like a small palace, much bigger than the Grumbach family home, and fancier. On that early Thursday morning, Tabby woke up as usual, and after the morning ritual of breakfast with her parents, she left for Clement's house. To her surprise, the front door was open, and she walked in, smiling at the thought of surprising her fiancé. Instead, she was the one who got the surprise of her life. Taking off her shoes so as not to alert anyone of her presence, she tiptoed down the hallway and then heard voices coming from the study. There were 3 people in there, and she identified them as Linda Grumbach, Clement, and Regina Schroeder, her best friend. Regina was also going to be her maid of honor, and Tabby didn't find it strange that she was at Clement's house this early. She raised her hand to knock, then paused midway when she heard Clement mentioning her name. "Grandma, it doesn't matter whether you like Tabitha or not. She'll soon be my wife and a part of this family, and even you know that it's a necessary evil. I would rather that you married Regina here. She's more suitable as a wife for you than that pretend princess will ever be." Expecting Clement to defend her, Tabby was surprised when he laughed scornfully. "Grandma, don't you know that I'm simply marrying that pretend princess, as you so aptly call her, because of what she will bring to this marriage? You know that at the time Grandpa died, the business was facing a lot of challenges. With the money princess Tabby is bringing into the marriage, we won't have to struggle to stay afloat. Her father is so desperate to get her married off to me that he promised me quite a hefty dowry. It's as though the man can't wait to get rid of his own daughter." They all laughed, even Regina, who was supposed to be her best friend. It was through Tabby that Clement had met Reggie, and it stunned her that they had now turned against her. "You don't have to marry that girl," Grandma Linda was saying. "She'll make a terrible wife, money or not. The last thing I want is for you to live a miserable life because you're tied to that girl. The business can pull through because we Grumbachs are a resilient lot. This isn't the first time that the company is facing such challenges. Over the years, ever since your grandfather started Grumbach watches, we've had our ups and downs, but we handled them and came out victorious. We didn't borrow or beg, and eventually things worked out. Money is one of the worst reasons for marriage, and you need to be very careful about what you're doing. Clement, marriage isn't something you can just take lightly and what happens after the 2 of you are married."
Grandma, dear, don't worry. We're living in the Gilded Age, or as I call it, the era of seeing the light, or aren't you aware of that? It's also the age of enlightenment. And right now, no one bats an eyelid when people get divorced, especially if there are good reasons for them to do so.
For now, all I need to do is make Arthur and May Kidman believe that I love their daughter so the wedding can take place. Believe me, Grandma, that won't be too difficult at all because those 2 are convinced that I'm the best thing to have happen to Tabby. No one has ever gotten a divorce in this family, and it's not about to start. Money or not, I won't let you bring shame to our family name, Clement. There are better ways of doing things rather than getting entangled into a web that you might not find easy to extract yourself from. Grandma will do things so silently that no one will really know. What if there are children? In this day and age, there are ways of preventing that from happening. Once I get my hands on the dowry, I will wait a few months and then announce to her parents that I cannot continue being married to a woman who is nothing more than one of those china dolls that May Kidman likes to collect. No matter how wealthy a man is, he still needs his wife to know a thing or two about taking care of him. I thought you said this is the age of enlightenment. Women aren't all that domesticated now since they have servants. Grandmother, you're just too much. Didn't you take care of Grandpa until his final days? But isn't that what servants are for? Reggie piped in. The Kidmans have a whole army of servants, and seeing as you'll be living in their house, your needs will be well taken care of.
Clement gave a snort of derision. Who said I was going to live in that dollhouse? A person has to tiptoe around everything lest they break anything. Just what kind of life is that? I have to pretend and go along with whatever the princess wants until I get her tied to me. After that, she will have to submit to me as her husband. I will have servants. Yes, but I also expect my wife to know how to keep house. A good wife should anticipate her husband's needs and take care of them, not expect the servants to do everything.
That's why you should be marrying Regina and not Tabitha. Linda insisted. She comes from a good family, and though they are nowhere near as wealthy as the Kidmans, her family is doing well too. Nana, Regina, and I have discussed this at length and decided that the best thing to do is wait. After Tabby and I get a divorce, Reggie and I will get married since we're in love. At that time, the business will once again be established, and we won't need the Kidmans' money more. Well, you seem to have thought about everything, but you need to be very careful. That pretend princess isn't as dumb as people make her out to be. She may be privileged and fragile, but behind those glowing blue eyes and golden hair lies a very shrewd brain. Regina and Clement both laughed out loud. Grandma, you're such a darling and a kind soul. That girl has no sense at all. All she thinks about are the latest fashions and being a part of America's who's who. Why, even her own mother told me that I'm the best thing to happen to her daughter, for I'm firmly grounded and will be able to steer her in the right direction, as if she were a ship. More laughter. Well, don't say I didn't warn you, Clement. The best laid plans of mice and men oft come to naught. Don't go all sage on me, Grandma, and don't worry. Tabby is an empty-headed woman who has her head in the clouds. She lives in a fairyland, but after we're married, she will soon understand that this earth is not the land of fairy tales. Much as Tabby wanted to cover her ears and not listen to any more, she also wanted to know everything. When she heard the scraping of a chair and knew that someone would soon be out, she fled, returning home and locking herself in her bedroom. No matter how hard her mother tried to get her out, she refused to open the door and didn't emerge for 3 days. Those had been 3 days of pain as she dealt with the betrayal, but they were also days of taking a good look at her life and making tough decisions. Now, as she sat in the park, a hard look entered her eyes. For 3 days, she'd wept for what she thought were her broken dreams and the fairy tale kind of life she had imagined she would live with her Prince Charming. But at some point the weeping had stopped and reason had taken over. She had finally accepted that everything that Clement and his grandmother had said about her were true. She was nothing more than a pretend princess with her head in fairyland clouds. The derogatory words stung like a scorpion's tail, but they were true nonetheless. Chapter 2. Variant Endeavor. And you really think you're up to this? Josiah Rusher looked long and hard at his younger brother. It was hard to believe that just a few years ago, Josiah had been a scraggly teenager, and now he was a man, determined to stand on his own 2 feet. What gives you the confidence that you will succeed? Jed, please hear me out. If ever there was a time Josiah needed his brother to believe in him, It was now. I'm listening. Go on. You know that for a long time now, Joshua Rafford has been running the only sawmill and lumberyard in Woodland. That has caused him to become very arrogant, and he now behaves like a little king, sitting on his high horse and looking down his nose at the rest of mankind. Ooh, strong words, dear brother. But true nevertheless. Josiah had to convince Jed that he was really serious about this venture. What's more, we don't get our timber from him, but have to go all the way to Sacramento. Yet nearly 50 acres of our land is covered in forest. I believe I can also start a lumberyard and sawmill business and run it successfully, giving Rayford some much-needed competition. That will also bring the prices down. Why even Monroe thinks it's a good idea. Monroe, huh? Yes, he'd like to expand his store and needs timber and building posts, but the price Rafford quoted him made him put his plans on the shelf, at least for now. You have to admit that Rafford's timber is of very high quality, and so he can afford to charge high prices. I know that, but you also have to remember that not everyone in Woodland seeks grade 1 timber. I could provide all kinds of timber so that there's something for everyone. What you say makes sense, but I have one fear. And what's that? The moment you start cutting down the trees from our forest, what's to stop other illegal loggers and lumberjacks from encroaching on our land? The forest would then soon be depleted, and posterity will blame us for not taking care of the land and its resources. We have an unwritten pact with nature to ensure that we take care of the environment and resources that God has placed in our hands. We have to be faithful stewards, Josiah. Josiah nodded. I somehow anticipated that question and prepared myself for it. As you very well know, Sophia's family returned to the reservation and the forest provides for their food. They are most definitely going to protect and conserve the forest, and they are our border to the west. To the north, we have the ravine, and unless someone has a death wish, I doubt they will try to access the forest through that way. To the east, there's this homestead, and to the south is the main road. No one can dare to rob our forests with all these borders in place. Sentinels on all sides, he grinned. You seem to have thought this through. I have, and with the help of John and Joshua too. Jonah and Sophia's family will protect the forests, and John is working on a fence that will deter even the most crafty tree robbers. Joshua needs timber and wood for his own construction business, so he too won't allow anyone to steal our resources. It all sounds good, but starting and maintaining a business are two different things. You may think you have everything covered now, but remember that it's not smooth sailing all the way. I know that and have thought about it long and hard. These past few months have been a time for me to learn a lot of things. Things may not run the way I expect or want them to, but at least I will have tried. Mistakes will be made along the way, but if the first pioneers had feared to come west, many Americans would still be huddled in the towns and cities of the East. Nothing worth doing is without risk. Jed nodded. Well said. So how can I help with your project? I need to get equipment from Sacramento and also need you to be a partner, albeit a silent one. I've already asked the others and they're willing, but we need you on board too. This had to work. It just had to work. It just had to. He'd spent many nights thinking about it, and failing wasn't an option. Why? Because it will be safer for all of us in the long run. A business entity run by a single person can soon fail, even if the person does his best. There's strength in numbers, and all 6 of you come with different skills that will help my business. If all of us are involved, it also protects the whole family in future. How so? Life is full of surprises, and no one knows what the future holds. there is no guarantee to the length of human life, and death-like change is inevitable. But being prepared for such eventualities removes the sting of anything that might come as a result. He paused and took a deep breath, aware that he was talking too fast. Say, I start my sawmill business and eventually marry, and something happens to me. The 6 of you will be there to ensure that my wife and children are well taken care of. But what if your wife won't let us do that? You know how women can sometimes be, and we don't know the kind of person that you'll end up married to, which is precisely why all of you should be partners. In that way, even if I'm not around for one reason or the other, my wife can't just rise up one day and decide to sell the business. She would have to consult all of you before doing such a thing. Of course, I'll be the major shareholder, but the rest of you will also have a stake in it. What did you have in mind? I own 30% and the 6 of you have 10% each. That makes 90. What happens to the remaining 10%? Sophia's family owns that remaining bit. And before you ask, yes, I already spoke with Chief Black Bear and he loved the idea. He said that my offer made him and his whole clan feel like they were really part of our family now. He was grinning. If they're an integral part of this venture, they will protect the forest even more, and we can all then enjoy the resources for years to come, and our children after us, maybe even to the 3rd and 4th generation. Isn't there a fear of the rest of the family ganging up to take control of the business? Would you do that to me? Josiah's grin faded, and he asked that in a quiet voice. If I had any fear of that happening, I wouldn't have brought it up in the first place. You're my brothers, and I trust you. True, but what about the future? What about it? The world is changing, and much as we know that we are united now, we have our children and their children after them. We may not have any control over their actions, whichever way they wish to go. That's true. But by then, we will have become wiser and will know how to protect the larger family, the land and its resources. Judah and McGraw are working on a document that will protect the family for the next 100 or so years. If our descendants choose to go another way and break up the family and what they own, there will be laws to deal with that then. No matter what happens, I believe that at least one of our descendants will love this land so much that they'll come out and defend it with all they have. Jed smiled, and Josiah was pleased that his brother finally looked convinced. In that case, I'm happy to come on board too. But we need to sit together as a family and talk about this. The best and probably only way for your idea to work is if everyone agrees to the same thing. No problem. I already arranged for a meeting with everyone else. You were the only one that I hadn't asked yet. Later that night, as he was in his house, Josiah thought long and hard about the future. His project was bound to be a huge one because the demand for wood products was growing just as fast as Woodland was too. More and more people were arriving to settle in their town and the outlying areas, and they needed building materials. Providing the products the new settlers and even older residents needed was something he could do, but utmost care also had to be taken. Like Jed had said, if they weren't careful, they might deplete the forest and create another problem in the future. He would have to speak with everyone to ensure that such a disaster never happened. Judah had suggested that they also plant more trees to replace those that were cut down, which brought him to another point. The fact that he was fighting for his future, and yet he had no family. Shouldn't that be the place to start first? Finding a wife for himself shouldn't be too hard, he thought. With his 5 older brothers all married, he'd been feeling the urge to also find a woman and settle down. Much as his sisters. In-law were lovely women, There was only so much they could continue to do for him. They all had their husbands and some even children to take care of, and he was feeling more and more like a burden. No one had said anything about it or treated him any differently, but he didn't want to impose on the good nature of his brothers' wives. Sifting in his mind through the few young ladies that he knew from church and around Woodland, he quickly dismissed them, for they were unsuitable as marriage partners. Those who were most suitable were either already married or engaged to be shortly. That left a few who weren't Christians, and he shuddered. Be not unequally yoked with unbelievers, Reverend Percival Goodman's voice thundered in his mind. You're only asking for trouble if you think you can marry someone who doesn't share your faith. You'll soon have a tug of war as to how you should raise your children and all that. The Bible clearly states that the prudent man foresees evil and hides himself, while the simple pass on and are harmed. Love is a wonderful virtue to possess, but inject a lot of common sense into your relationship as well, or you'll soon find yourselves queuing outside McGraw's office and enriching him while you destroy your own families as you seek to be divorced. Indeed, Josiah thought the pastor was right. Why marry in haste and then have to go through the pain of separation and divorce, and in many cases with a lot of ugliness? Wasn't it better to get the right person by being patient? But for how long was he going to wait? Seeing Jed and Abby's family growing was what had led him to building this 2-bedroom house for himself. They needed privacy, and Abby needed to be able to take care of her husband and children without feeling the pressure of looking after her brothers. In-law as well. All of them, save for Jeremiah, were now out of the main house and living their own lives, which was just as it should be. He often wondered why Jed had never employed a housekeeper for his wife. With 2 children now and the expanding ranch, Abby had so much to do and needed help. He twisted his lips. Never would he allow his own wife to work as hard as Abby did, especially now that there was money. Oh yes, his wife would have a housekeeper or 2, even 3, because all he expected her to do was take care of him and their children when they came. Chapter 3. The Decision. Tabby couldn't believe that her parents were determined to go ahead with the wedding, especially after she had repeatedly told them she wasn't marrying Clement. Her mother was especially persistent, and she was doing a lot of running around in preparation for a wedding Tabby knew wasn't going to happen. No matter how much Tabby tried to stop her, she wouldn't listen. Today, like all the other days, her mother had come into her bedroom as soon as she woke up. Tabby sometimes felt that her mother was bored of being a housewife and needed a project to work on. Maybe that was why she was so involved in planning for this wedding. Honey, it's natural for a bride to get nervous as her wedding day approaches. May folded the clothes that Tabby had flung across a chair the previous night. She could just never sit still without her hands doing something. Why, when your father and I were engaged, I ran away from home twice within weeks of our wedding day. Mama, you're refusing to understand what I'm telling you. I'm not nervous about the wedding day because it's not going to happen. I'm not marrying Clement, and there's nothing you can do to convince me otherwise. You're not in your right mind. I'll get Lucia to bring you some warm brandy so you can calm down. You know that I never touch any of that stuff, and just so you know, no matter how much brandy you give me, I'm not changing my mind, Mother. Please respect my wishes on this, and let's not argue about it anymore. She stood up from the ottoman she was sitting on. I need to get to the office now. I promised Papa that I would help him with the payroll, and it's getting late. As part of management, I have to live by example and not report to work whenever I want. That's another thing we have to talk about, dear. Your insistence on still going to your father's office is bothering me. Working amongst those rough men isn't something that I want you to continue doing anymore. Why? Tabby turned genuinely puzzled eyes to her mother. What's there to talk about? And why don't you want me going to the office? I've been doing it since I was 18, so what's changed now? The fact that your husband will not want you to continue working for your father once you're married. What? Did he say that? May nodded, but not in so many words. She stood up and walked over to her daughter. She took her hand. A good wife takes care of her husband's every need. You can't continue working if you're to be a good wife. Sacrifice is what is called for when it comes to marriage, and for the most part, that involves making your husband happy. Tabby shook her head, a brittle smile on her lips. So what you're saying, Mother, is that a woman has to give up her life in order to make her husband happy, right? Something like that, yes. Thank you for just making me even more determined not to marry Clement. Now please let me go to work. She moved back to her unmade bed and sat on it. She would have made it up as she'd been doing for the past few days, but Lucia would then be in trouble with her mother, so she left it as it was. But your father said he doesn't need you to continue helping out. Papa is also supporting this madness? He wants what's best for you. We all do. Why don't we go down and get some breakfast, and then we can go and check on your wedding gown? Tabby closed her eyes and counted up to 10, as Lucia had taught her, before turning to her mother. Mother, she tried to be as calm as possible. We're not going to have this discussion ever again. I have changed my mind about marrying Clement, so there won't be any wedding gowns or other preparations. I'm done, and please just let me be. I'm really tired of hearing people talking about this wedding that isn't going to happen. That having been said, it's time for me to leave if I'm to make it to the office in time. Has Papa already left? May's brow furrowed as she looked at her daughter. My love, I don't understand you. If we were living in the Dark Ages, I would say that someone has bewitched you. Why? Just a few weeks ago, you could barely sit still when you spoke about your upcoming wedding. You were so excited that you practically glowed. If your father and I hadn't insisted on a 6-month engagement period, you and Clement would already be married by now. And I'll forever be grateful to you and Papa for that, Ma. You saved me from making a terrible mistake, and she really meant it. At the time, she had wept on Lucia's shoulder, wondering why her parents wouldn't allow her and Clement to get married immediately. She loved Clement and was ready to be his wife, but her parents were standing in the way of their happiness. All things work together, for good for those who love the Lord. Child, Lucia had held her as she murmured into her ear. You may not understand what is going on right now, but the good Lord knows best. One day, you'll look back on this day and be grateful that your parents didn't allow you to rush into marriage. And Lucia had been proven right, and she gave her mother her best smile. Mama, refusing to let us get married at the time was the best thing you could have done. I'm sorry that at the time I behaved like a difficult child, but now I understand it all. You and Pa did the right thing and stopped me from making a terrible mistake. No, my love, we only held back the wedding so your father's sister could make it. Your Aunt Sheila from Britain really wanted to come for your wedding, and she'd made us promise that we would wait until she got here. But it turns out that it was just a waste of time after all, because she changed her mind about coming. Something about the weather not being right. May looked angry. That woman, she muttered. We should have allowed you to get married 6 months ago, and then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Tabby twisted her lips, wishing her mother would leave her alone. She could feel a headache coming on and rubbed her forehead with her thumb. Once the wedding is over, you'll soon be happy and settle down in your marriage. It helps a lot that you'll be living in this same house, so you won't have to make any drastic changes to your lifestyle. Your father and I will eventually retire to our house at the seaside, so as to allow you and your house at the seaside so as to allow you and your new husband to have some privacy. Tabby lay on her bed and turned away from her mother. She was just realizing how stubborn the woman could be. Every protestation she had brought up had been brushed to the side, and May Kidman just had to have the last word. The woman was determined the wedding would happen, and arguing with her was giving Tabby a headache. "Honey, are you all right?" "Mum, may I be please left alone for now?" She needed her mother to leave her alone so she could get out of the house. "Sure, I'll send Lucia up with your warmed brandy." "Thank you, Ma." Right now, she was willing to agree to anything as long as it got her nagging parent out of her bedroom. Tell her to take her time with it. Why? So I can sleep a little bit to calm my nerves. That's why you need the brandy. But unlike her friends, Tabby never took any alcoholic drinks, not even wine. Lucia had been a big influence in her life, and it was through the maid that Tabby had started going to church. Of course, her parents used to take her when she was a little girl, but when her father got so busy with his work and her mother with her charitable organizations, that stopped some years ago. But then, Lucia convinced her of the benefits of going to church, and she had started once again and loved it. Now she went not because Lucia asked her to, but because she wanted to. In the days after receiving the shock that had changed her life, she'd sought solace in the house of God, spending a lot of time there whenever she wasn't at work. That was the only place that her mother couldn't get to her easily. "Let me check on Lucia then. Do you want something else like a bun or a pie?" "No, thank you, Mother." "Very well then." May walked to the door. It was a relief when she finally left her room. Tabby quickly got up and locked the door to keep everyone out, because she couldn't stand anyone coming in to bother her again. After about 10 minutes, she heard footsteps which stopped outside her door and then a soft knock. "Miss Tabby." "It's Lucia. Your mother sent me to bring you something to make you feel better. I have warm port with honey and lemon. Please open the door." "Lucia, just leave it outside the door and I will take it when I'm ready," she called out as she put on her clothes for work and got ready to leave the house. Arthur Kidman owned the largest sawmill in Ridgeway, and the company supplied timber and other wood products to the whole of Vermont and even beyond. He'd inherited about 1,000 acres of woodland from his father and set up the mill. This was another of the places where Tabby found solace after her dreams had been shattered. Before that, it had just been mere formality that she came to the office at all. She had a good head for figures and would often help out with administrative duties, but only when the mood suited her. Now, it had become her lifeline to get her through the dark days of despair. Dealing with orders, supplies, clients both new and old, and the payroll kept her very busy and left her with no time to think about Clement or his betrayal. By the time she got home in the evening, she was usually so exhausted that she simply dropped into bed and was immediately asleep. If Lucia didn't insist on her getting up to wash and eat, she wouldn't bother at all. As usual, her father was in his office when she walked into the building. It was a log cabin that had 5 rooms. Her father's office, the main reception area, the foreman's office, the store, and her own small office. "I didn't expect that you would be coming in today," her father called out when he heard her footsteps. "Didn't you have other women things to do with your mother today?" "I promised to help with the payroll." "Your mother had mentioned that you were going to check on your gown today." "I didn't think you would be coming, so I got started on the payroll myself." Tabby rolled her eyes as she walked to her father's office. That meant a big mess, of course, which she would have to sort out. "I'm here now, Pa. Let me carry on." "Thank you," he smiled at her. I don't know how you make it seem so easy when all I see is a jumble of numbers." He looked quite bewildered, and she giggled. "Oh, Pie, you taught me all that I know, and now you say that you don't understand it anymore. You must be getting quite old." "Indeed I am, which is why I'd like to see a few grandchildren before I get too old to enjoy them." "Not again, Pa." She pointed at the journal. "That has to be taken care of if we're to pay salaries tomorrow." She picked up the large books and cradled them in her arms. "Let me work on these today, and then we can talk about anything else later." "Sure. Go ahead." Her father waved her away, and she sighed in relief. After spending time with her mother, who stubbornly refused to accept that her engagement to Clement was over, she didn't need any more from her father. Once she was in her office, she sat down and stared unseeingly at the wall for a few minutes. She had to get out of Ridgeway, or else people might just walk her down the aisle by force. Working on the books, for her father, gave her purpose and relief, and she was glad that she wasn't marrying Clement after all. Apparently, he was the kind of man who wanted a wife to cater to his every whim, and that was something she wasn't prepared to do, especially not now. More and more women like her were entering into the professional world and excelling at what they were doing. Even though she hadn't been very dedicated to her work in the past, she now appreciated it. That Clement had spoken to her mother about not letting her work after they were married really irritated her. Who did he think he was, making decisions on her behalf? But then she sighed, knowing that at the time he'd thought that he was only doing what was best for her. Hadn't she made herself out to be helpless and frail and needing the protection of a man all the time? He'd only been doing what was expected of him as a husband. It was all her fault for making people believe that she was totally helpless and fickle, a brainless woman who was unable to make any decisions of her own. Clement had called her an empty-headed woman with her head in the clouds. Well, not anymore. Her head was thinking right now, and she was going to do something about her life. Take control, as it were. Yes, she still believed in love and marriage, but this time it was going to be on her terms. She would find a man who was willing to marry her, but never again was she going to let him control her and make all the decisions for her. Then she sighed and sat back in her chair. Where was she to get such a man? All those she knew were cut from the same cloth as Clement, expecting to control their wives' affairs and the women obeying them without any questions. The answer came to her later as she was going through the newspapers that were delivered to the offices daily. Her father had gone out to make arrangements for cash for the salaries tomorrow because she'd completed the payroll. Of course, he wouldn't withdraw the money required today, but he usually presented his check a day before so that the clerks had enough time to process it for payment. As she waited for him to return, she browsed through the newspapers, and her eyes were drawn to the advertisement section. Men searching for wives and women searching for husbands, all out there in the West. Her father always spoke about the West as a place where self-made millionaires were thriving. He called it the land of promise. Hitherto, she'd never given much thought to the West, and whatever went on there, it had seemed so far away and held no interest for her. But now, she took a closer look at the advertisements. Some were downright absurd, while others made her shudder. But there were a few that caught her eye, and one in particular. A respectable 22-year-old male farmer and rancher, intelligent, tall, handsome, and hardworking, is desirous of marrying a simple young lady aged between 20 and 22. She must be a Christian and virtuous without question. No wealthy ladies need reply, as the advertiser has an unconquered aversion to rich women. The candidate should strictly be single. never married and with no child. Right candidate will be treated well. Reply to Box 544, Woodland, California. Tabby read through many more adverts, but found herself returning to this particular one. It was the man's comment that he was averse to riches that decided it for her. This was definitely a man who wouldn't be marrying her for her father's wealth or the dowry he could receive. Pulling pen and paper closer, she penned her response to the advertiser and waited for 2 weeks before she got her response. 1 week later, Clement came to the house. Tabby had just returned from the office and was resting in the drawing room when Lucia came to inform her that she had a visitor. "Mr. Clement is here to see you, Miss Tabby." "Where is he right now?" "Your father has taken him to the stables to look at the new horses, but he said he would be back shortly." "Good." Tabby stood up and hurried to her bedroom, Lucia following her. She knew she looked disheveled and didn't want to be caught at a disadvantage. She hadn't seen Clement since the morning that she heard him, his grandmother and Reggie talking about her. Many times she had wondered what she would do when she finally came face to face with him. Shortly, she would find out. "Lucia, I need to wash up. Could you please find out if there's some hot water downstairs?" "Right away, my lady." It didn't take her long to refresh herself, and by the time her father led Clement back to the house, she was quite composed. It also surprised her that she didn't feel her heart fluttering the way it used to whenever she saw Clement. "There you are, my darling." He walked over to her and bent to kiss her on the lips. But at the last moment, she turned her head so it landed on her cheek. "Here I am," she said, not letting go of the newspaper that was in her hands. "Lucia told me you were in the stables looking at Pa's new bays. What did you think of them?" She saw the frown mark Clement's brow and smiled inwardly. The man thought he had her all figured out, but her actions right now clearly troubled him. "Would you like something to drink?" "Some brandy will do nicely." He unbuttoned his coat and joined her on the couch. She stood up as if to serve him, then sat elsewhere. She rang the bell and a servant, not Lucia, came in. "Mr. Clement will have some brandy. Anna, let my mother know that we might have an extra person for lunch." She looked at him. "Will you be staying for lunch?" Clement didn't respond, but looked at her long and hard, as if seeing her for the first time, and Tabby hid a smile. Truly, her actions were surprising him and even herself. In the past, she would be running all over or begging him to stay. Not anymore. He'd broken her heart and she was over him. She had shed her tears and prayed that it was all a bad dream and that she would wake up to find that Clement loved her. She had also longed for him to come by the house, but in nearly 2 weeks, he hadn't appeared, and finally she had accepted that she was getting over him. "What's wrong with you today, Tabby? Have I offended you in some way?" Tabby noticed that her father had slipped out of the room, probably to allow them some privacy. "I don't understand your question, Clement." "There's something different about you that I don't understand." Tabby shrugged. "I'm still the same person that I've always been." "No." Clement shook his head. "You look different and I want to understand what is going on." "You were supposed to come by my house days ago so we could talk about our wedding plans. Grandma and I waited for you, but you didn't show up and never even sent word excusing yourself. I've been very busy helping my father at the mill. Please convey my sincere apologies to Mrs. Grimbosh." "Is that all you have to say?" Tabby was prevented from responding when her mother came into the living room, both arms outstretched. She rolled her eyes and buried her nose once again in the newspaper, paying little attention to what they were saying. Tabby, her mother had to practically shout for her to realize that she was being addressed. "You're being very rude to our guest." Tabby thought about making a nasty rejoinder, but she didn't want to hurt her mother. She hadn't told anyone what she had overheard, and her mother shouldn't have to pay for Clement's mistakes. "I'm sorry, Ma. I was just finishing up an interesting article in the newspaper." She folded the paper and gave them her attention. "Clement was just asking if you like white swans or doves at the wedding." Her mother was boxing her into a corner, and she didn't like it one bit. So she decided that she was going to be as non-committal as she possibly could be. "Let him decide, for he is the man of the house," she said sweetly. "He has such good taste." "See, I told you that nothing is wrong," May said happily, and Tabby hid a smile. "She's just tired after coming from the office." Tabby could see Clement struggling with his thoughts. "What about flowers, dear?" Her mother once again turned to her. "Roses, lilies, carnations. What do you prefer?" Once again, Tabby gave Clement a sweet smile, making her eyes blank so she looked like someone who had no brains to think for herself. "Let Clement decide for me, mother dear. He knows what I like." Tabby found herself enjoying the subtle taunting, and by the time Clement left, she knew that her heart was quite over him. Of course, her ego was still bruised at the derogatory remarks he'd made about her, but she knew for a fact that she had never been in love with him. It was all a case of infatuation, and thankfully she was quite over him now. Chapter 4. Here Comes the Bride. For the first time, a Rusher is actually doing things the proper way right from the start. Deputy Gaines slapped Josiah playfully on the back. "Why didn't your 5 brothers do this right from the beginning and avoid getting into a lot of trouble? Would have saved all of us unnecessary headaches, if you ask me." There was good-natured protestation from all the other Rusher brothers. As he looked at them standing there dressed in dark suits and starched white shirts with bow ties, Josiah felt so blessed that he was part of this family. They had all come a long way and been through a lot to get here. He'd been a pre-teen when they lost their parents, and Jed had decided that they should come to California. They had all been bewildered and uncertain about the future, but had gone along with whatever Jed had decided. He was the head of the family, and they all looked up to him. Then Abby came into their lives, and more changes were wrought. Like a mother, she'd nurtured them all, protecting them while also admonishing them all with love, Jed included. The past few years had seen them all become mature in many different ways. With a smile on his face, he walked over to Abby and hugged her. "Thank you very much, Abby." He kissed her cheek. She patted his back while laughing softly. "Where is this coming from?" "You've been my rock, and I know that I speak for all of us when I say that, but for you, today wouldn't be happening. I wouldn't be half the man I am right now. Thank you for being there for us, Abby." He could see that his words pleased his sister-in-law. Then he turned to his oldest brother. "Jed, thank you too." He turned to the others, "and all of you for playing such an important part in my life. Without you all, this day might not be happening in this way." "Indeed," the deputy said. "Their mistakes have worked out for good, and it's a wonder these lovely ladies chose to marry them at all." His wide grin and wink removed the sting of his words. "Deputy Gaines, you're not being fair to me." Jonathan raised his hands. "I never caused you any trouble." "True, but you got a whole tribe of Indians stomping around your yard, screeching at the top of their voices. That scared many people into believing that you were under attack." He grinned at Josiah. "Now this one is actually doing everything by the book. Congratulations, boy, you've done us all proud." "Thank you, Deputy Gaines." Josiah's bow tie felt a little tight, and he ran a finger on the collar of his new shirt. This was it. His wedding day, his 6 brothers and 5 sisters. In-law were all present at the station waiting with him. Tabitha Kidman, his bride. To-be was about to arrive on the train, which was about half an hour away. From the station, they would be going straight to church to get married. Just make sure you don't change your mind upon seeing your bride and give us trouble like Judah. Then try to beat up the next man who looks at her. The deputy guffawed at his own joke, and Josiah joined in when he saw his brother's face, which was as red as a cherry. Just a few months ago, Judah had married Lindsay, his sweet wife, after rejecting her at first. It had taken a mistaken notion that someone else wanted to marry her to make him come to his senses. He'd gone to fight Hugo Grant, the newspaperman, because he thought the poor man was trying to steal his fiancée. In actual fact, Lindsay had been playing matchmaker so that Hugo would marry her sister. Judah had ended up in jail for 4 days. On his wedding day, Lindsay had made his brothers drag him to church, where he was ready to fight Hugo again when he found him standing at the altar. But that was until he saw her walking down the aisle on her father's arm towards him, and her sister too. That was when he understood what was going on. Josiah rocked on his heels, wagging a finger at Judah. "But you won the girl in the end, didn't you?" Just fancy that, from jailbird to groom, all in one morning. Judah growled deep in his throat, eliciting laughter from his brothers and the deputy. "Easy there, Judah." Jed stepped forward. "Josiah is just messing with you because he's nervous. If you hit him, imagine what his new bride will think as soon as she steps off the train." "You're lucky it's your wedding day." Judah wagged a finger at Josiah. "Else you and I would be having a meeting behind the barn." "Judah," Lindsay said from his side, and he wisely shut up. "Leave your brother alone. Now, come with me," and she led him away like one would a child. "Don't go getting all hot under the collar when you know that what they're saying is true." She turned her head and winked at Josiah. "Come. There's something I want to show you." Of all the brothers, Judah was purportedly the mildest, but he was still a bit sensitive about having landed in jail and being left there for 4 days. Good thing was that Lindsay was a very wise woman who knew how to handle her man. "What is it you want to show me?" Judah asked, allowing himself to be led away. "You'll see. Just come with me." Jeremiah threw his head back and howled with laughter. There were 7 on the shelf and 6 rolled off. Now there's only 1. He made a face at Josiah. "I thought you would hold out for longer." "Jeremiah," John pulled his brother away by the collar. "Will you stop that right now? Making fun of us is good, but look at Josiah. Go easy on him or he might just sweat out of those clothes." More good-natured laughter and ribbing ensued. The deputy winked at Josiah. "Ignore them and don't let their words get to you. I'll bet that they were no better than you on their own wedding days. Besides, I think I hear the train arriving." When Tabby stepped off the train and saw the crowd standing on the platform looking in her direction, her steps faltered. Josiah had told her that his family was large, even sending her a photo that had been taken on the day one of his brothers, Judah was it, wedding. The whole family, including the little children, had been captured by the photographer. In that particular photo, he'd circled his own face so she would easily recognize him. The Rusher men were all very good-looking, and the women standing next to them seemed really happy. But she felt a little bit intimidated. Being an only child, she'd never been around such a large crowd, at least not one of people who were so closely related anyway. In a way, she envied Josiah his family because he told her that they were very close. He had people to share happy and difficult moments with, while she'd only had Lucia. The poor woman had wept and begged Tabby to bring her along, and much as she'd wanted to, She resisted the urge. She resisted the urge. She had to prove to the world, but mostly to herself, that she was no empty-headed woman who was incapable of taking care of herself. Coming to the West meant working hard, and most of it probably manual labor, and she would do it, even if it killed her. No one was ever going to treat her like a fairy princess anymore. She was a grown woman determined to work hard and earn the respect of those who knew her. When she told her parents that she needed time away from all that was going on, they'd thought that she was taking a short holiday. Her mother had even suggested that she travel to England to stay with her aunt for a few months. They thought she had wedding jitters and had even agreed to postpone the wedding, actually convincing Clement to be patient. Because she didn't want Lucia getting into any trouble, she hadn't even told her the reason why she was leaving home, or how far away she was going. Clement had tried to come to the house to make her change her mind about traveling, but she'd refused to see him this time. Leaving home and knowing that she might not see her parents for a very long time had made her very emotional. Even though they were sometimes difficult and overprotective, she understood that they did it out of love. She loved them so much and had wept as she packed, wishing she could tell them the truth, but knowing that if she did, they would stop her by any means necessary. With her emotions being very raw, she wasn't sure that she would have been polite to Clement. Lucia had overheard her the first time she had taunted Clement and had made her disapproval very clear. "Miss Tabby, vengeance belongs to the Lord and not to man," she had said. "Do not gloat over your enemy or trample him down. No matter how badly someone has treated you, it isn't right to behave the way you did." "But I did nothing wrong, Lucia." "You were pretending to be very sweet, but in actual fact, you were being very insulting in a subtle way. It's a wonder your mama didn't catch on to what you were doing." Lucia had always been her voice of reason, and she would miss her. What would she say if she knew that in a very short time she was going to be getting married? Reggie, too, had come by the house, and they had been very polite to each other. A person seeing them might not have known that at one point they were very good friends who had shared almost everything. She'd been so tempted to tell Reggie what she had overheard, but in the end had kept silent. As Lucia said, it didn't pay to be nasty. Vengeance belonged to the Lord. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the platform and out of the way of a seemingly impatient young woman with whom she'd exchanged greetings at the beginning of their journey. Someone broke away from the crowd and she identified him as Josiah. He started walking towards her, and she took another deep breath. He was even more handsome in person, and she felt her knees go weak. "Ms. Tabitha." "Welcome to Woodland." His voice washed over her like soft waves. "Thank you for making the long journey out here to be my bride." He held his hand out and she placed hers in it. Josiah felt her trembling slightly and immediately felt protective over her. She looked so fragile and intimidated by everything around her. "Thank you," she whispered huskily, immediately feeling safe and protected even though she was meeting him face to face for the first time. "My family," he pointed at the grinning crowd, "are all here to meet you. Come, I'll introduce you to everyone, then we can go to church and get married." "I know you said your family was large, but I didn't expect that they would all be here," she said breathlessly. "Don't be intimidated by all these people. They are all harmless. Come, this is," and one by one, he introduced her to his family, including the little ones. She barely caught their names before she was whisked away to the church for her wedding. Tabby had attended many weddings in her lifetime, all full of pomp and lavishness. Yet it was her own simple wedding that brought tears to her eyes. She'd never cried at any wedding, but from the moment she walked down the aisle and stood beside her tall husband, her tears wouldn't stop flowing. Seeing the look on Josiah's face as she walked towards him made her heart do a flip. His eyes were so intense, and even though they had just met, she felt as if she'd known him all her life. Was this what Lucia had meant by being soulmates? In the months after her engagement to Clement, the maid had often asked her if she was sure that he was her soulmate. "What does that even mean?" she'd asked, laughter bubbling within her. "What does it mean to be someone's soulmate, and how can you even tell?" "You will just know if he's the one," Lucia had said softly. "Somehow you'll just know." Of course, she had brushed her maid's words aside because at the time she thought she was in love with Clement. But now, looking into Josiah's eyes, she just knew that Lucia had been right. This man was her soulmate, and her heart just knew it. Josiah couldn't believe that the beautiful and almost ethereal woman gliding down the aisle towards him was soon to be his bride. Of course, as they were communicating, she'd sent him a photograph of herself, but he didn't think she would look that good. No, not good, but magnificent. Even though she'd just stepped off the train, Tabby looked like one of those models out of the different magazines that his sisters, in-law, loved to giggle over. She was stunning, and all his "bone of my bone," he repeated after the Reverend, "and flesh of my flesh. This day you and I become one, Tabitha, and I promise to love, cherish, protect, and provide for you all the days of my life. So help me God," and he meant every word of it too. Tears were coursing down her cheeks, and he took his large white handkerchief out of his pants pocket and gently wiped them away. "My love, my flower, please don't cry. Don't cry," he said so tenderly that she cried even more. She could hear the oohs and ahs in the background, and wondered if she was being foolish, bawling like a baby. But all that mattered was that her new husband understood her emotional state and gave her all the time she needed to compose herself. Chapter 5. Onset of Trouble. "We're here." Josiah's deep voice cut through Tabby's thoughts, and she registered his comment and the fact that the buggy had stopped in front of a freshly whitewashed house. While she was grateful that she was finally married, it frightened her that she didn't know her new husband at all. The desire to leave Vermont and put as much distance between her and Clement had overruled any fears she had had of the unknown, but now that she was faced with this situation, she didn't know if she'd really thought things through. Why hadn't she waited for a few days before tying the knot? The Reverend had even asked if she was ready or if she needed some time to think things through, and she'd assured him that she was set. Nothing was going to stop her from making one of the most important decisions of her life at the time. But now she wondered if she hadn't been in too much of a hurry. Josiah Rusher was turning out to be exactly like her father, and she wasn't sure it was something she liked. He was treating her like she was very fragile and delicate, and it made her want to grind her teeth in frustration. Right from the moment she'd arrived, he'd held her hand like a child, and it was only propriety that stopped him from personally walking her down the aisle himself. The only time he'd let go was when she had to walk down the aisle on Deputy Gaines's arm. But immediately after they'd said their vows, it was back to holding her hand again, and he hadn't let go since. Even now, as they were in the buggy driven by one of his brothers, he still hadn't let go. "You have a beautiful home." "This isn't our home. It belongs to my older brother Jed and his wife, Abby. You met them at the station, but we'll get to know everyone better eventually. Abby and the other ladies so graciously offered to host our reception." "That's very kind of them. Come, let's get you better introduced and settled." Is this where we'll live? No, my love. We have our own house. But for now, let's just enjoy our wedding reception. Beth baked us a beautiful cake, and the others have outdone themselves too. Tabby was surprised at the many presents that they received from Josiah's family. Everyone seemed to have something to give her that would make her life as a new bride on the ranch easier. From a churn to a laundry basket and iron pots and skillets, she had everything they thought she would need. Tabby balanced the laundry basket on her hip. As she prepared to step back into the house, she just removed the clothes from the line, and folding them was going to take some time, as she was just learning how to do it. There was a lot that she was going to have to learn, and her husband wasn't making things easy for her. Married for only 4 days, and she already felt like strangling him. Just who did he think he was, ordering her not to touch anything? What was worse, just that morning, he'd brought in a woman and informed her that she was their new housekeeper. The nerve of the man! All this was done without consulting her, and she was done having decisions made for her. If the man thought that she would take it all without saying a word, then he didn't know her at all. "What are you doing, Mrs. Rusher? You know that you're not supposed to carry the laundry basket around. I was going to get the clothes before starting dinner." Tabby paused, closed her eyes, and then turned them onto Melinda. It wasn't the poor woman's fault because she was simply following her master's instructions, but this was her house. "Melinda, I told you that I can do this." But Mr. Rusher said, "That's it, girl. Where I come from, servants don't talk back to their mistresses. I want you packed and gone by the time I'm done folding this laundry. Do you hear me? Mrs. Rusher, I'm sorry it won't happen again. I need this job very much. Please don't send me away." "You don't need this job, Melinda. I happen to know that you live with your brother and his wife, and they are taking very good care of you. That's what Josiah said. You don't have to work for others just to prove a point. You do it because you really want to. This is my house, and it's too small to accommodate all of us. So I'll pay you for the whole month, even though you only worked for a few hours." Mrs. Rusher. Silence. Tabby used a tone she would normally never use, and it made her feel bad when Melinda cringed as if struck. "I don't want to argue any more with you, Melinda. Please just go into the bedroom and get your staff and get going. It will soon be dark, and I don't want you walking home in the dark." She watched Melinda walking out, tears pouring down her face. But she hardened her heart. It really wasn't Melinda's fault, but Tabby had had it with people overlooking her desires and treating her like some weak and frail thing who couldn't even prepare dinner. Of course, she didn't know how to do it, but what was so hard about preparing a simple meal? She'd watched Lucia and the cook back home, and she was sure she could put together something edible. Having received cooked meals from Abby, Sophia, and Beth for the past 3 days in a row, she didn't want to be the wife whose husband enjoyed eating other people's food. "What's going on here?" Josiah walked into the house a few minutes after Melinda had left. "Why is Melinda crying, and why does she have her bags with her?" "Because I let her go. That's why she's crying." "Why?" "Because this is my house, and I have a say in everything that happens here." Her eyes were flashing at him. "Or do you have something to say about that?" "Honey," Josiah drew closer. "Stop right there, Josiah Rusher." She held a hand up. "Don't try to soften me up when you know that I'm very upset with you." "Why, my love? What have I done to upset you?" "Because you're treating me like a child. I'm your wife and deserve to be treated as such." "What did I do wrong?" Tabby narrowed her eyes at him, picked the basket up, and walked out the door towards the bedroom, leaving her husband staring after her in bewilderment. What had he done wrong now? Recalling what Jed had told him the evening before he got married, he decided to follow his wife and find out what the problem was. Never leave the house without resolving any outstanding issues with your wife, Jed had said. You might return and find that things have gone wrong. Before you leave home, make sure that your little lady is happy, for then she will be praying for you to have good success wherever you go, Josiah. If you leave a weeping woman behind, she will be too broken up to uphold you in prayer, and who knows what trouble awaits you out there? My darling! He entered their bedroom to find Tabby seated on the bed, her hands covering her face. He saw that she was crying. Tabby! What's wrong? You're what's wrong, Josiah, she sobbed, palms still over her face. Please tell me what I did wrong, so that I can make things right. He sat next to her and tried to take her in his arms, but she pushed him away. It's the way you're treating me. I don't like you making me feel like a foolish child who has no idea what they should be doing. You did it right from the moment I stepped off the train. How? He was genuinely puzzled, holding my hand everywhere as if I can't walk or stand on my own, insisting that you'll do everything for me even when I can very well do it, employing a servant for me when I didn't ask you for one. What's wrong with you? Well, pardon me for trying to be the good husband here. He couldn't understand why she was so angry when all he was trying to do was make her life easy. Wasn't that what husbands were supposed to do? Take care of their wives? You're not being a good husband. You're being a bothersome one. Josiah felt that the attack was unwarranted. So what do you want to do about it? Just leave me to find my place in this marriage. Give me the chance to prove that I can be a good wife, like all the others. In that case, then, I'll not bother you with anything again. Fine. Fine, he answered. I'll leave you to your own miserable company. Yes, do that, and get out of my way. And I'm leaving. Don't worry if I don't come back. Don't come back if you still have that nasty attitude. Fine. He walked towards the door. Why can't you be more like Abby? He muttered as he left the bedroom. His sister-in-law was very humble, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her argue with Jed, if ever. Tabby collapsed on the bed once her husband had left. She was really miserable, and his parting words, though spoken under his breath, had reached her ears, so she wasn't good enough for him. It was times like this that she really wished Lucia was here. Then she shook herself. Wasn't she trying to prove that she could do this all on her own? She was now a grown woman, and married too. Domestic squabbles were to be expected. Hadn't Lucia told her that when she was preparing herself to become Clement's wife? No marriage is perfect, little one, Lucia had said. You have to work hard at it. It's not all a bed of roses, and even if it is, remember that roses also have thorns. But she hadn't listened to Lucia. According to her, she and Clement would be the perfect couple and show the world what marriage is all about. She realized at that moment that marriage was more difficult than people made it out to be. How did Abby and the others do it? They looked so happy all the time. What was going wrong in her own marriage? Chapter 6. Trouble in Paradise. He meant it too, Josiah told himself angrily, as he walked away from his wife. He wasn't going to come back home, not while his wife was being very difficult. What had he done wrong? Never once in his 22 years of life had he come close to slamming the door as he did right at that moment. All he was trying to do was help, but it seemed like each time he did anything, His wife got more upset with him. What was wrong with her? When she'd first arrived, he'd been struck by how innocent and young Tabby looked, even though she was 21. She'd looked like a harmless kitten, but now he could see that even kittens have sharp claws. When he got to the small intersection that had recently been created because of the expansion to the homestead, he stopped and glanced back towards his house. He could clearly see the front door and waited to see if Tabby would come after him. Something within wished she would, but then he shrugged. She was probably crying her eyes out like she'd been doing for the past 3 days. Was this how marriage was going to be for the rest of their lives? Why hadn't he listened when Jed told him to be patient and wait to get to know his bride first? Someone looks upset. Jonathan appeared out of nowhere, startling him. They stood at the intersection, one of which led to Jonathan's house, the second to his own, the third one to Joshua's place. Are you going to see Joshua? No, I was on my way to Dad's place. Where are you coming from? My house, and you look startled. That's because you came upon me suddenly. Don't ever crawl up on me like that again, or you might just get yourself shot, and thus render Sophia a very young widow. Hey, little brother. It's not my fight, so don't drag me into it. You're not even carrying a gun, so how would you shoot me? What if I had been carrying one? Sorry for startling you. Please forgive me, but I saw you leaving the house and hurried to catch up with you. Pardon me for bothering you. Jonathan made as if to walk on ahead, but Josiah restrained him with a hand on his arm. He had the grace to look ashamed of himself. Sorry, Jonah. It's just that I'm having a really rough time. He scratched his head and the bewildered look returned into his eyes. Honestly, Jonah, what am I doing wrong? Tabby and I are arguing all the time. It's like we can never agree on anything. Jonathan chuckled. You've been married only 4 days and are already complaining. What did you do to your little woman now? Why does it have to be me who is in the wrong? Oh, believe me, it's all you and I know that because I'm your big brother and have seen you at your best and at your worst. So what's making your bride unhappy when you should be enjoying marital bliss? I got her a housekeeper so her life would be easier. But what did she do? You did what? Jonathan's tone was incredulous. I got her someone to help around the house. And from your expression, I can see that your loving efforts didn't go down very well with Tabby. Josiah made an impatient sound. She fired the woman before the day was even over. Who does that? The poor girl ran out of the house weeping. Brother Josh put a heavy hand on Josiah's shoulder. Did you ask your wife whether she needed a maid or not? I didn't ask her because I wanted to surprise her. She's my wife, and I don't want her overworking herself. I really care about that woman, but she's driving me mad. She doesn't see it as care, but interference. Domestic matters should mostly be left to the women to handle even though we're there to help. Especially when it comes to hiring house help, let your wife do it. Or else you're just creating a lot of trouble for yourself. If she needs something, wait for her to ask you for it. Let the idea come from her, and you'll have peace, otherwise it will be a battlefield all through. Well, pardon me for trying to be a good husband. If that's your attitude, no wonder Tabby is miserable. My wife is new to marriage, and I was just doing it to help her. You're also new to marriage and need to learn that women are very complex beings. I know that I haven't been married all that long, but it's not as easy as people like to make it out to be. Marriage takes hard work, and you're going to have to pull together as a team and not apart as individuals. Learn to listen to your wife and hear what she's not saying. What's that supposed to mean? Sometimes it's not the words that matter, but the actions. What is Tabby really upset about? She claims that I'm not letting her run her home. And is she wrong? Josiah sighed, shaking his head. I guess she's right, but I just want our home to be perfect like Abby and Jed's. And therein, dear brother, lies the trouble. Abby is not perfect, and if you try to measure your wife according to her standards, she will definitely fall short. Abby has been in marriage for close to 5 years with Jed, and 2 years with her first husband, and Tabby is just starting out. Even you have to admit that our dear older sister didn't always get it right in the first days, and she's not there yet. This is a journey, and you want to get to the destination without taking the wrong route. That won't work. But what do I do then? You'll find your way, don't worry. But be ready for a lot of tension and disagreements. It doesn't mean that Tabby doesn't love you. It's just that she's also trying to find her own way. You see, she has it more difficult because there are 5 other very smart women before her. Any normal person would be daunted by that, and Tabby is no exception. She probably feels that you're judging her by the standards of her sisters-in-law, and it's making her lash out. That woman is determined to do what she can to prove herself in your eyes. Don't ever compare her to anyone else. The 2 brothers walked silently until they got to Jed's house. He was just coming out of the house and hailed them from the porch. Abby says to come in for something to eat. I just ate a few of Sophia's pies, and my stomach can't take anything more. Jonathan declined the invitation. Josiah headed to the house. Where are you going? Jonathan asked him. We have a lot to do, so no dilly-dallying around. Let me say hello to Abby and the little ones, then I'll be joining you in the barn. See you shortly then. Josiah joined Jed on the porch, and they watched Jonathan disappear into the large barn. I thought you were coming with Tabby. Where is she? He received a sharp look and laughed, raising his hands in the air. Calm down, sir. If you have issues with your wife, don't act nasty with me. Sorry, Josiah mumbled. Wipe that woe-begone expression from your face, or Abby will demand to know what the problem is. You know that once my wife gets it into her head that things are wrong, she'll want to step in, and I'm sure that's not what you want right now. No, maybe I should avoid Abby then. Go on in. She'll be annoyed that you didn't go in to say hello. Whatever you do, keep away from the topic of Tabby. Come up with a good excuse as to why she couldn't come with you. Very well then, aren't you coming in? Jed shook his head as he walked down the steps. Let me go and see what Jonah and the workers are up to. Josiah felt the need to knock softly just to let Abby know that someone was coming. Come in, Josiah. I saw you through the kitchen window. Just come right through. He walked into the kitchen where the aroma of roasting meat overwhelmed him. His stomach growled, and Abby looked at him with a raised eyebrow, but said nothing. That smells really good. Wild hog. Jonathan caught one as it was trampling the corn, and it looked like the leader of a herd which was sighted over the hills. Sad that such a tasty animal is also responsible for a lot of destruction to crops and farms. Well, John was talking about reinforcing the fence again. Have you gone that far yet? She flashed him a smile and went back to kneading some dough. Would you like a cup of tea? She put the dough aside and, without waiting for his response, reached for a large mug and poured him some from the kettle that was whistling merrily on the stove. I just made a fresh batch of pies. Get a few from the pantry, please. I have to hide them from Jacob, or he'll eat himself silly. Thank you, Sister Abby. I told you to drop that sister thing. How is Tabby? "She was folding clothes when I left the house." He answered vaguely and walked to the pantry to get himself a pie. Truth be told, he was relieved that Abby had offered him something to eat. Tabby had attempted to make breakfast and burnt the toast, while the eggs had shells in them. That was the reason he'd gone out to find a housekeeper, but his attempts to be a good husband had been misunderstood. "Will you be staying for dinner?" Josiah knew that the polite thing to do would be to refuse and go back home to whatever Tabby had prepared. If breakfast had been such a disaster, his stomach tightened at the thought of what dinner might be like. Today was actually the first day that his wife was making her own attempts at cooking since for the past 3 days. They'd received food baskets from his brother's wives. The last meal had been warmed up by Melissa for their lunch before Tabby sent her packing. He'd been counting on the housekeeper to prepare dinner for them. Abby opened the oven to baste the roasting meat, and the fresh aroma decided it for him. "Thank you. That's very generous of you." He didn't want to have to explain why he wasn't going home for dinner, so as soon as he finished his tea and pie, rinsed the cup and plate more out of habit than anything else, and joined his brothers in the barn. He didn't realize that Abby had walked to the kitchen window and was observing him thoughtfully. Something was wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. It seemed like Josiah was avoiding going home. Then she shrugged. It wasn't her business, and Josiah hadn't asked for her help, so she wasn't going to interfere. Chapter 7. An Irate Wife. A few days later, Tabby realized that she was fighting a losing battle in as far as trying to please her husband was going. He left before she woke up and returned home late when she was already in bed. "I can't go on like this," she murmured as she twisted her damp hair into a thick chignon at the back of her head. Beth had borrowed her hot comb, and she needed it or her hair would become unmanageable. After shrugging on a light coat and picking up a bottle of mild rosewater that she had promised her sister-in-law, she set off for Beth's house. Using the shortcut she discovered, she trudged through the light bushes, not bothering to head for the common path. This was a straighter path to Beth's house, and she liked walking through the trees. The soft breeze kept her company the whole way, and she was glad to see Beth, standing on her porch holding her youngest child. "I hope you're not planning on going somewhere," she called out. "No, little Henry is just being fussy, and BB is asleep inside. I don't want her waking up just yet. Please come in." Tabby shook her head. "I just came to bring you the mild rosewater that I promised, to help with Henry's nappy rash. Oh, my love, you're a lifesaver. The boy doesn't sleep and the itching gets worse when it's so hot. Lucia, the woman who looked after me from when I was young, used to make lots of it and to sell on the side. She was the one who told me how good it is for rashes, and I've used it for cuts and burns." She held up her right hand. "I didn't know that cooking involved a lot of bruises and burns." "You poor thing, still having a rough time with that stove?" "I've just learned how to use the top plates, but still avoiding the oven." Tabby was glad that Beth didn't judge her for not knowing how to use a lot of the equipment in the kitchen. They had come to some sort of agreement where Beth would teach her how to cook, and she would help her with styling her hair whenever the need arose. "I'm wondering whether all this is worth the bother." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Hang in there, dear sister." "How do you do it, Beth?" "Do what?" "Have a husband, cook so well, deal with 2 little children, keep a very beautiful home, and still manage to remain sane and happy. Believe me, it will come to you in no time at all. The difference between us is that I grew up having servants do everything for me, and now I feel so ashamed that I never took an interest in housekeeping. Don't beat yourself up for something that isn't your fault." "But it is. Lucia would try to make me do 1 or 2 things, but She twisted her lips in self-derision. Anyway, let me not trouble you with my own woes when you have this little one to take care of. I just need to use the hot comb because I washed my hair and it gets so tangled up. Maybe I should just cut it. Which reminds me, Sophia said she'd like you to style her hair before Sunday. Beth held the dozing baby to Tabby. Hold him for me, please, while I get you the comb. What if he wakes up? This was the first time Tabby was actually holding a small baby in her arms. In the past, she would admire them while they were in the arms of their parents. It terrified her. What if I drop him? Beth giggled. You should see your face, Tabby. Don't worry, we women are created with a natural instinct to protect young ones. Here, she placed the baby in Tabby's arms. You'll soon be a mother yourself, and this is the best time to practice what is to come. She disappeared into her house. After the first terrifying moments, Tabby soon found that she liked holding the baby. He snuggled close to her and she felt something in her throat. He was such a beautiful baby, and she wondered what she would feel when she held her own child. Those were things she hadn't previously given serious thought to. Being around her sisters-in-law and their young ones had stirred something within her. But would Josiah be pleased when the time for them to have a baby came? If he could barely stand to be in her presence, how would he enjoy the baby with her? Jed and Joshua were such good fathers to their children, and watching them made her wonder what kind of a father her own husband would be. She had never actually seen him spending much time with his nieces and nephews. Maybe he was one of those men who parented from afar and the thought filled her with dread. Here you go, Beth returned with a hot comb and a covered tin. I baked some cookies and pies and thought you might like to have a few. Thank you. Do you want me to take the baby? Beth asked, and Tabby shook her head. See, I told you that the maternal instinct is in every woman, at least the normal ones anyway. He looks so peaceful and beautiful. That's because he's asleep now. When the rash irritates him, he howls and sometimes I feel like crying myself. But Joshua is so good with him. When Bibi was as little as Henry, she had the same problem and he would stay up all night with her, even though he had to go to the farm the next day. You're lucky to have such a considerate husband. Josiah is a good person, Tabby. You'll find your place eventually. No marriage is perfect and it takes work, patience and love in strong measure. Beth, I feel bad about asking you this, but was Josiah always this unreasonable? How so? He doesn't want me to ask questions or give suggestions about anything. If I ask him about how to do something, he doesn't show me but goes ahead and does it himself. I feel like I'm a table in this marriage, just to be used when needed but relegated to the side the rest of the time. Tears gathered in her eyes. Tabby, Beth put a hand on her arm. Don't cry. Things will work out, you'll see. Thank you for being so kind. Let me go before Josiah comes home and starts sending out a search party for me. He thinks that if I set foot outside the house, I'll be swallowed by the trees or something. Beth laughed softly so as not to wake the sleeping child. Tabby, one thing about these Rusher men is that they're very loving and overprotective. Don't imagine that you're the only one going through this. We all did, but eventually they're learning how to handle us. Marriage is something that you work on for the rest of your lives. Don't imagine that things become perfect and you live happily ever after, like fairy tales tell us. The thing to do is learn how to be patient with each other. You make it sound so easy. It is, and then again, it's not. But you'll find your way eventually. Josiah walked into the house and found it empty, and his heart skipped a beat. Tabby hadn't told him that she would be going anywhere. Then he laughed at himself, Of course, she had probably gone to see one of the other ladies. Being out here could be lonely, and his wife struck him as someone who enjoyed the company of others. Hearing a footfall on the porch, he stepped towards the door and opened it. "Oh," Tabby said breathlessly, "I didn't expect that you would be home at this time." Was that resentment in her voice? "I decided to come home early and spend time with you. Where have you been?" Are you asking to interrogate me, or you're truly interested in knowing where I was and how I spent my afternoon? She placed the tin and hot comb on the table and turned to him. "I should also ask you where you were." "Tabby, please, let's not fight." "I'm not fighting. Just wondering why you're asking me where I was. Or does this mean that I'm not supposed to set foot outside this house?" "You misunderstand everything that I ask, and honestly, it's becoming tiresome." "Then you should have married someone else." The words shot out of Tabby's mouth before she could stop them and pounded against Josiah's skull, making him want to shake his head violently to drive away their ominous sound. "Then perhaps you now have the perfect wife that you're obviously looking for." "Tabby, Tabby." "Don't Tabby me, Josiah. It's quite obvious that I'm not the kind of wife you were hoping to get." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to. A contented man would find reasons and time to spend with his wife. But no, you purposely choose to spend all your waking hours with your brothers or out in the fields, and when I take a walk outside the house, you feel offended. Do you know how it feels to stay all cooped up? In the house alone. I got you a housekeeper, but you sent her away. What more did you want me to do? So you think the solution to my problem is a housekeeper?" Tabby was so angry that she gave her husband a sharp look and walked out of the living room. Josiah shook his head, quite perplexed. What was he doing wrong? It seemed like everything he tried to do to make his wife's life easier only ended up aggravating her. This was going to have to stop because they were making each other miserable. The next day, Tabby waited for Josiah to leave the house, then she walked to the table where his journals were. Her husband would rather spend most nights going through these books than come to bed, and she was in a foul mood. The man was untidy, and she wondered if that was the same way he'd behaved while living with Jed and Abby. She was about to fling the books to the floor in anger when something caught her eyes. "Rusher and Rusher Sawmills" was the title on one of the journals, and she got curious. All fighting and anger forgotten, she sat down and started going through the books. Before long, she realized that everything was all wrong. The accounts didn't seem to balance, and she frowned. If this was the family business, it was in trouble. Someone was either deliberately doing the books wrong so they could gain from the sawmill, or else they had no idea what they were doing. "What are you doing?" Josiah's voice startled Tabby, that she dropped one of the journals. "Why are you going through those books?" "Don't take that tone with me, Josiah. I'm your wife, and not some competitor who is out to steal business from you." She tapped the top journal with a finger. "I don't intend to upset you, but there's a lot that's wrong with these books." "What do you know about accounting?" "I realize that you have men working for you, but you need a really capable person to supervise the logging and all." Josiah stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "Who do you suggest?" "Me." "You?" His tone was incredulous, then he burst out laughing. On seeing her serious face, he stopped laughing. "You're serious?" "Don't look so shocked, 'cause back in Vermont, there are women loggers too." "Of course I'm serious. Would I make a joke like that? What do you know about logging in any case?" "My father owns the largest sawmill in Ridgeway. and I used to help him with a lot of the administrative work." Josiah was surprised at this piece of news and realized that he didn't know much about his wife, except what she had written about herself in the letters they had exchanged. But one thing he was sure of was that at no time had she mentioned that her father owned the largest sawmill in their hometown. Or she could just be saying that to impress him because he'd caught her going through the books. Still, he chose to humor her. "That's office work. What do you know about actually being in the woods cutting down trees? I'm not saying that I will pick up a saw or try to chop down any of the trees, but I can supervise as I used to do for my father whenever he wasn't around." Josiah shook his head. "I don't believe this. If that's your solution to the problem I'm having, then it's no." Frowning, Tabby got to her feet. "It's a brilliant solution, and you know it, Josiah. Or do you think that because I'm a woman, all I am is a wallflower?" "I didn't say that." "But your tone and expression are implying it. Ever since I was 18, I've been working in my father's company and helping him out. Why can't you believe that I know something about logging and the timber industry? I just don't think you're the right person for the job. The loggers are tough and rough men, and I doubt that they would listen to a woman. Are you speaking for the men or for yourself, Josiah? Out here, women do the domestic chores and leave the tough work for the men." Tabby felt as if she'd just been slapped. So much for trying to help her husband with his work. He was as narrow-minded as Clement and to some extent her father had been. It had taken a lot of convincing for her parent to let her work at the sawmill. "You're letting your prejudices against women hamper your vision? Josiah, when you calm down, think about my idea. This is the West and not the East, where women are pampered and spoiled. I've read a lot about women on the frontier, the pioneers as it were. None of them sat back and let the men do everything. There were and still are those who have had to pick up the reins when their husbands, brothers, or fathers are indisposed, and they've done a good job. Or are you afraid that a woman will do a better job than you? Don't think so highly of yourself, Tabby." Her response was to raise both eyebrows at him, then disappear into the kitchen. "So this is where you've been taking your meals?" Tabby's voice made Josiah look up. He flushed guiltily. "Don't you have your own home to eat in?" "I was working with Jed and he invited me for dinner. Lunch I can understand because it makes no sense to come all the way back to the house. But dinner too. So who do you expect me to eat with?" Tabby walked up to the table, aware that Jed, Jeremiah, and Abby were staring at her. She ignored their surprised looks and took her husband's plate. It's only right and fitting for a married man to take his meals with his wife, especially dinner. She walked to the kitchen and poured the food into the bin, put the plate in the sink, and returned. "Come home now." She held her hand out and Josiah looked at his older brother, who gave him a slight nod. "If your wife doesn't know how to cook the way you want, then I suggest that you teach her how to do it. Abby told me that she taught all of you how to cook, so if you don't like my food, why don't you show me how to prepare it?" "I'm sorry." "Good." Tabby turned to Jed and Abby. "I'm sorry to have interrupted your dinner, but I have to take my husband home." "That's all right." Abby looked amused and Tabby's heart settled down. She knew she was taking a risk by storming into Abby's home, but she was tired of taking meals alone. Even though the food oftentimes ended up in the bin. They walked home in silence, and Josiah felt his stomach growling. He'd been about to enjoy a succulent steak, but his wife had ended that. "Tabby," he said when they got into the house, "what is it you want from me?" "To be treated with respect, Josiah. You've been taking all your meals at your brother's house, and it's not fair to me or Abby for that matter. She wants to spend the evening with her husband, maybe talking about how her day was. But there you are. I know that I don't know how to cook because no one taught me." She shook her head, and even if they had wanted to, I wasn't interested at the time. But I'm willing to learn and don't want to make people feel like I don't know anything. I'm sorry you feel that way. Josiah knew when to argue and when not to. "Do we have any bread and ham in the house?" "Yes. I got some from the store today, and Monroe said to thank you for the timber. He told me that he was surprised that you had given him so much timber at such a low price." Monroe is a good friend. He walked to the kitchen, not wanting to get into another argument with his wife over his business. To tell the truth, he was struggling with the administrative side of the business, but he didn't know what to do. His brothers were all busy with their own work, and the ranch so no one could help, and he didn't yet trust any of the men he had employed. Tabby also knew when to shut up, and she followed her husband to the kitchen, where he showed her how to make simple sandwiches and also make a nice cup of coffee. "The secret is in being patient," he told her. "Thank you for teaching me." Josiah was pleased, and he smiled as he carried their simple dinner to the dining table. "Honestly, Jed, I don't know what to do. Some days are good and others are just frustrating. I'll never understand this woman that I married." Josiah raked his hair with his fingers. "I don't know what to do," he repeated. John, Jonathan, and Judah were present, and they chuckled. "What's so funny?" he demanded. "You are," Judah said. "That woman wants you to be proud of her, but you want to continue treating her like a frail little flower." Jed told us that she tossed a perfectly good piece of steak into the bin. Lucky had a field day, no doubt. "She can't cook to save her life." "Then teach her," John said. "If you want peace at home, my brother, you're going to have to let go some of your old ways of thinking and start seeing the world from a different point of view. If your wife can't cook, then do it with her and show her how to do it. But then again, don't go making her feel like she can't do anything right. She's your wife, and you promised to make her happy. If teaching her how to cook and keep house will make her happy, then do it." "John is right," Judah put in. "Spend time with your wife. Josiah, you've been spending a lot of time with us and going home very late. How do you think that makes your wife feel?" Josiah bowed his head. His brothers were right, and he'd been feeling guilty for spending many hours away from home. But he did it to avoid conflict because he never knew what mood he would find his wife in. It was better to find her already in bed and avoid any unpleasant words being exchanged. "And how is the business coming along?" "Jed, do you know that Tabby told me she worked in her father's sawmill back in Vermont?" "Really? So she must know something about the business and can help you to run it." Then Jed laughed. "From your expression, I deduced that she made the offer, but like everything else, you turned her down." He told them about Tabby's suggestion to supervise the loggers. "She doesn't know how rough the men out here can be." While that's true, I doubt that most of them would attack or harm her. "Besides, you'll be there with her all the time. Or don't you trust your wife to run the business and do a good job?" "It's not that." "Josiah," Jonathan smiled at his brother, "let go of the ideas and notions that women are weak and need to be protected. I know you saw our father doing that to our mother, but that was a different time and another world altogether. Out here in the West, we all have to pull together, men and women alike. It's how the West is going to expand and prosper when all of us are involved." Tabby said as much. "Do the right thing by your wife, Josiah," John said, "and I suggest that you start right away. Go home and prepare a lovely meal with your beautiful wife and let her know how much you love her. Women are fairly easy to please just as long as you take the time to listen to them. Don't ignore her feelings no matter how silly or petty they seem. A happy wife, a happy life. Chapter 8. An olive leaf. The first thing Tabby smelled when she woke up the next morning was the aroma of bacon and eggs. Nicely done and not burnt, like was her practice. There was also a small flower on the pillow where her husband's head should be, and she smiled. She hadn't heard Josiah come in last night, and this morning had prepared herself not to see him very soon. Getting out of bed, she quickly dressed and then went to the kitchen. "Good morning." He smiled at her, and her breath caught in her throat. This was certainly a first in so many days. Usually, they just mumbled greetings at each other and then went their own ways. "Did you sleep well?" Surprisingly, yes. Which was true considering that she had spent last night weeping into the pillow as she once again waited for her husband to come home before she fell asleep. Knowing that her eyes were swollen, she averted her face so he wouldn't notice. But Josiah saw the red eyelids and knew that he was the one who had made his wife cry. It made him feel like a heel. "Please sit." He stopped what he was doing, took her hand and led her to the dining table. "Breakfast is almost ready, and then you and I need to talk." Tabby kept the smile in place, though her heart lurched painfully. This was it. Josiah wanted to end their marriage. She was so sure that he would tell her that this marriage was not working and he wanted to set her free. 1 month had gone by, and things didn't seem like they were going to settle down soon. If he had started preparing meals, then it was a sign that he was trying to show her that he could live without her. Another voice told her to be calm and wait to see what was going on. Breakfast was eaten in silence, and it was delicious. Tabby had to admit that she had missed a properly prepared one. "Tabby?" Josiah pushed his empty plate away, then took her hand. "I just want to say that I'm really sorry for the way I've been behaving. It's my duty as your husband to take care of you and show you what needs to be done so you can enjoy this marriage, so we can both be happy. Things are going to change from this moment onward." "What do you mean?" she whispered, and Josiah saw something like fear in her eyes. "Tabby, I love you so much, and I want our marriage to be happy for both of us. So, I have a suggestion." "Go on." Hope crept into her heart, warming it up. "You seem to know a lot about logging, and I know how to cook and clean. My suggestion is this. Why don't we work together and so learn from each other? You will teach me all about logging and the works, and I will show you how housekeeping and cooking is done. You're not sending me away." Her heart leapt with joy. "Whatever gave you that idea?" "You seemed angry all the time, and for you to have woken up to prepare breakfast, I thought you were trying to tell me that you could live without me." "Oh, my darling." He pulled her from her chair so she sat on his lap. His arms went around her, and she felt safe. "Tabby, I love you so much, and though we've only been married a month or so, I know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. This marriage is forever, and I know that we'll have ups and downs along the way. But if we work as a team, we can overcome anything that comes our way." Oh, Josiah! She was so happy, and she buried her face in his shoulder. "I was so scared that you wouldn't want me to continue being your wife. I was afraid that I wasn't good enough for you." "What?" "It's true. I can't cook or clean or keep a nice house like Abby, Sophia, and the rest. And I know that you want a woman who can do all those things." He buried his face in her neck, and she felt his chest rumbling. "Darling, are you crying?" "No." He raised his face, and she saw the sparkle in his eyes. I thought that you wouldn't want to stay married to me because of our different stations in life." "What do you mean?" "It's obvious that you're well-educated, beautiful, and smart. That you gave a simple country boy like me the chance to be your husband still puzzles me to this day." "You can't be serious." "But I am. From the moment you stepped off the train, you struck me as someone who is used to being taken care of. That's the reason I went out and got you a housekeeper. Little did I know that I was offending you. Forgive me, please. We've both been very silly indeed, and instead of sitting down to talk about it, we were avoiding each other. I'm sorry also for the part that I played in making your life really miserable, but I promise to learn how to cook, clean, and take good care of you." Josiah laughed. "You're not my servant, my darling. We'll do all those things together for the rest of our lives." "And I would have it no other way," she beamed. So this was what it felt like to be loved, accepted, and appreciated. She would enjoy the rest of her life being married to this wonderful man. Tabby opened another file. She wanted all the records up to date before she called the brothers for a meeting. The business hadn't been running for long, and even though things didn't look good, there was promise. But there was also so much that needed to be put right if they were to see profits in the next 12 months. She wished she could get advice from her father's foreman, but she didn't want to write and let him know where she was. Leaving home had been her struggle for independence, and even if she didn't tell Sykes where she was, the postmark would be a dead giveaway. No, she just had to call on her memory to help her. She sensed, rather than saw, her husband when he entered the room. He stood behind and gently massaged her shoulders. "You've been going at this for so long that I'm afraid you'll overstrain yourself." Instead of getting annoyed as she would have done before when Josiah expressed concern for her welfare, she placed a hand on his, which was still on her shoulder, and looked up at him. "I'm about done, and then you need to call your brothers for a small shareholders' meeting." "Why? Is there something wrong?" "No. But when working for my father, I found out that keeping everyone in the loop prevents unnecessary questions in the future. It's easy for people to think that a business is doing well, especially since we're moving a lot of timber and logs. But they also need to know that there are costs and overheads that have to be dealt with. Then also, you all need to agree how the profits will be shared out. Do you want to share them so everyone does what they want with their portion, or do you want to plow them back into the business for a while at least? There's a lot to be dealt with when running a business enterprise such as this one." Josiah kissed the top of her head. "I never knew that I had such a smart woman for a wife, and I'm so proud of you, Tabby. My foolishness almost made me overlook such a wonderful gift that the Lord had given me." "Josiah, that's all in the past. As I said, I married a very wise and smart woman." The praise made Tabby glow within. Her husband thought she was smart, and he wasn't just saying it because he thought it was what she wanted to hear. Josiah was one of the most honest men she'd ever met. "And I married a loving husband." Chapter 9. Here Comes Trouble. The business seems to be hanging on a ledge, but that's normal for any new business. However, I can see that there's a lot of promise in a few months' time. "We should be doing well," Jed commented while scanning the books that Tabby had presented for the brothers to check. Chief Black Bear was also present, and he'd brought 3 elders with him. This was one of the many shareholders' meetings that Tabby had insisted on, and this was the 3rd. "We wholly approve of what you're doing, and I'd like to suggest that we hold meetings, maybe once every 2 months or so." "I agree," Tabby said. "Meeting every week is a bit strenuous because of putting things together, unless anyone has a different opinion." She looked around at the men who she had come to love and respect. They all treated her like a woman, yes, but also like someone who really knew what they were doing. This was the respect she had yearned for, and it was thanks to her husband that she was getting it. No one opposed Jed's idea, and the meeting soon broke up. As usual, they were meeting in Abby and Jed's house, because their living room was more spacious. Tabby walked to the kitchen, a smile on her face, which soon died when she saw the expressions on Abby and Sophia's faces. "What is it?" "This." Sophia pointed to an advert that made Tabby's blood run cold. There was a picture of her, and though it had been taken a year or so before, it still identified her clearly. $5,000 reward. Missing from Ridgeway, Vermont, and daughter to the subscriber is a young lady named Tabitha Dorcas Kidman. She is 21 years of age, 5 feet 4 inches tall, has baby blue eyes and thick gold hair. She is feared to have been kidnapped, and the above reward will be given to anyone who can give information of her whereabouts. I have to find Josiah. She grabbed the paper and ran back into the living room. Josiah saw his wife enter the room, a panicked expression on her face, and rushed over to her. "What's wrong?" "This," she showed him the advertisement. "We need to talk." "I believe we do," he said seriously. From their conversations in days past, he'd come to the realization that his wife was from a wealthy background. Seeing the reward offered made him wonder just how wealthy. He led the way to the porch, and they both sat down. "You aren't the simple woman you made me believe when you came here, are you?" Tabby shook her head. "My father is Arthur Kidman, one of the wealthiest men in Vermont. I told you that he owns the largest sawmill in Ridgeway." "I thought you were joking at the time because you wanted me to let you handle the books for our business. So it was true." She nodded, feeling the chilly atmosphere rising between them. She didn't want to fight with her husband. Yes. "Why did you deceive me then? Did you think I would marry you for your money?" Her startled gaze flew to his face. "Josiah, it's not like that. Your advert said that you had an aversion to wealthy women, and I was tired of being treated badly by people because of my father's wealth." The sadness in her voice quashed the anger he was feeling and made him take her in his arms. "Tabby, you realize that I don't know much about you at all. I have never asked because I didn't think it was important, but apparently it is." He pointed at the advert. "This changes things, and it would be nice for me to know a little bit more about your background. Before I came here, I had just broken off an engagement to someone who wanted to marry me just to get his hands on the dowry that my father had promised him." "Your father was paying him a dowry." Josiah frowned. "I thought it's supposed to be the other way round. That it's a man who should pay dowry for his wife. Do you know that I was actually working up the nerve to ask you who your parents are, and if they are still alive? I know you told me that your father owned the largest sawmill in Ridgeway, but at the time it didn't strike me that he was all that important or wealthy enough to offer such a reward for finding you. Why would you want to meet my parents?" Tabby had the fear that her parents wouldn't approve of Josiah, and that would break her heart. Vermont Brahmins had a way of looking down on those they considered to be of lower social status than them and could be cruel about it. She couldn't stand to see her beloved Josiah being humiliated. "Is it really important for you to meet my parents?" "Of course it is, unless you're ashamed of me." "I could never be ashamed of you, Josiah, not for a single moment." "Well, the reason I want to see your parents is so that I can pay your dowry for. That's the right thing to do." "Well, my father was prepared to pay dowry so that I could be married. Clement, that's the name of the man I was engaged to, owns a watchmaking business, which isn't doing well, and the dowry would have uplifted him." Josiah felt jealous of the unknown man, even though he told himself that he was being unreasonable. Tabby had married him, hadn't she? She'd broken off her engagement, but what if she still had feelings for the man? Why didn't you marry Clement? Many marriages have started on less footing and survived for decades, with the people eventually falling in love. If having my dowry was merely the case, I might have considered marrying him. She twisted her lips, and he knew there was more to come. I found out that he and my best friend planned on getting married after he divorced me. What? On what grounds? Clement said that after a year, he would tell my parents that things weren't working out between us, and since this is the age when anything goes, it would have been a quiet divorce. He would have been a quiet divorce. He would have received my dowry and sorted his problems out, and then I would no longer be of any importance to him. But what about if there was a child born during the marriage or on the way? Would he have taken that into consideration? Well, as he said, there are ways of preventing a baby from being conceived. The divorce was to take place after about a year or so of marriage, and when he was sure that his business was secure, Josiah felt badly for her and held her closer. I'm so sorry about that. It's not your fault. No, it's not. But on behalf of other men who treat women badly the world over, please accept my sincere apology. She leaned into him. Things were going so well between them that she'd forgotten all about her life back in Ridgeway. She was also finding out that Josiah was very loving, just as Beth had said. We're going to have to think about what to do concerning this advert, my love. Why don't we just ignore it? He shook his head. Ignoring things doesn't make them go away. It's a wake-up call for us, Tabby. How so? Out here, such adverts only bring trouble. You see, my brothers John and Joshua have had their fair share of trouble after being thought to have kidnapped their wives. We promised the deputy sheriff that it would never happen again. This is going to bring us trouble. We have to write to your parents and tell them that you're all right and not being held here against your wishes. Otherwise, the next thing that will happen is that bounty hunters and every other detective will descend on us. Because of the reward, $5,000 is a very enticing incentive for people to cause trouble. Pshaw. Tabby waved a hand. My parents are still treating me like a child and trying to get me to go back home. That advert is in poor taste, if you ask me. Be that as it may, we still need to ensure that no trouble comes out of it. Why don't we send a telegram to your parents? Don't they have a right to know that their daughter is alive and well? Think about how worried they must be knowing that you could be somewhere in dire straits. No, they have to know that I'm no longer a child and I'll only contact them when I'm good and ready. In any case, I rarely go to town, so I don't think people know me that well. Believe me, anything that the Rushers do is news, and you're well known. Many people know that we're happily married and would stand by us, but it's the others that I'm worried about. We have to write to your parents. But try as he did, Josiah failed to convince his wife of that. Leave them alone. When I feel that the time is right, I will write to them, was what she said. Don't worry about it. I'm sure no one will see this advert, and even if they do, they know that I'm happily married to you. Josiah tried to convince himself that his wife was right, and they were making much ado about nothing, but he couldn't help but be worried. John had nearly been hanged when Kate went missing, and her father accused him of kidnapping her. Joshua, too, had had to face his namesake when Beth mistakenly married him instead of Rafford, and someone would definitely want to claim the $5,000 reward that had been offered. He would have to be very careful and watch out for any strangers or suspicious characters hovering around their homestead. Who are you? Josiah looked at the 3 formidable men standing in front of Jed's house, wondering who they were. He hadn't noticed them coming up the driveway because he'd been so busy playing with his nieces and nephew. They also hadn't come in a buggy, which he would have heard, and he supposed that their horses were tethered somewhere out of sight. It was clear that they had wanted to use the element of surprise. "My name is Josiah Rusher, and this is private property." "Just the very man we're looking for," one of the men said. He was burly and looked quite intimidating. "Please don't give us any trouble." He seemed to be the spokesman. Josiah stood up, and the 3 children clutched at his pants. "I'm not a troublemaker," he looked down at the children. "Would you please not look so intimidating, for you are scaring the children?" He was babysitting the little ones today, while the rest of the family visited Kate and John. The couple had just found out that they were going to have a baby and had invited the whole family over. But Josiah was recovering from a bout of the flu, like the children, and he didn't want to take chances and make Kate ill. Tabby had offered to stay with him, but he made her go with the rest, telling her that he would be fine. "Good, then you won't object to coming with us?" "Where and why?" "Don't you know that you kidnapped a woman and brought her out here to California without her consent?" "I did no such thing. Tabby is my wife, and she's here on her own free volition." "We'll see what the law has to say about that." "In any case, where is she? How sure are we that you haven't sold her into slavery or something even worse?" "Are you serious?" He looked from one to the other. "How could I sell my own wife?" "We don't see her around, and so we want to make sure that she's all right. Tabby and the rest of the family went to visit our brother who lives on the other side of Woodland. They will soon be back, and then you can question her and see that she is here because she loves me and we're happy. Spare us the romantic stuff. We can't wait any longer because we have to be on the 7 o'clock train back east. Let's go. I'll go with you, but please let me make sure that the children are all right first. There's no one else around to take care of them. I have to go to the fields and find one of the laborers who will come and sit with them until their parents return. Do you take us for fools? Do we look that gullible to you?" "No, sir. It's just the right thing to do since these little ones were left in my care. It's only right for me to leave someone to take care of them until their parents come back. You criminals and fugitives are all the same, thinking you can pull wool over our eyes and make an escape. Well, tell the children to sit right here and not leave. But as for you, we're taking you away right now. It's getting dark, and the children will be scared all alone. Lock them in the house, and let's get going. One way or another, Josiah Rusher, you're coming with us dead or alive." Those words silenced Josiah, and he turned to Jacob. "You're the oldest here. Take care of Amy and Bibi. Your parents will be back soon." He was just glad that Beth hadn't left the smallest child with him. Henry was just a few weeks old, and it would have been really difficult to leave him behind. These men meant business and weren't going to leave him alone until he went along with them. "Would you let me then leave a note for my wife and brothers? We don't have time to babysit you while you do whatever you want. You're a criminal and as such, deserve no favors. If you don't step down right at this moment, we're going to have to use force on you. That won't be necessary. I'll go with you." He pushed the children inside the house and locked the door from the outside. They started crying, and he looked at the men, hoping they would be compassionate enough to let him comfort the children, but all he saw were cold and serious faces. "Let's go then," he said, his heart weeping for the distraught little ones. He prayed that his family would return home soon. "Give me your hands, Josiah Rusher, and I don't expect any trouble from you." "You'll get none," As he was being led away in handcuffs, he turned and saw Jacob's face pressed against the window. The child started screaming for him, but the burly man jackknifed him on his horse. The movements jarred his insides, and he felt like he was going to black out. The ride to the station was the longest he'd ever taken, and he soon realized that the men were avoiding the main road and using hidden paths. It was as though they didn't want anyone to see them taking him away, and he knew that he was in real trouble. At the station, it was no better as they formed a human barrier around him. Since the station was empty at that time, no one paid much attention to them, and when the train arrived, he was hustled into it. The sound of crying children reached the party that was returning from Kate and John's home, just as they entered the compound. "Sounds like the children are in distress. I can hear them crying," Abby said, hurrying to get to the door. "Where is Josiah? And the lights haven't even been turned on." "I don't see him around." Tabby looked to see if her husband could be close by. She was shocked that he would let the children cry so much. Or maybe he took medicine for the flu and is asleep. That's very unlike Josiah. Jed joined his wife, and the door is bolted from the outside, which indicates that he left the children so he could go somewhere. But shouldn't he be back by now? Can't he hear the children crying? Jed looked really angry. This is totally irresponsible, whatever he's up to. Maybe he's gone to the outhouse. Jeremiah called out from somewhere in the darkness. "Let me see if he's out there." "He could have used the washroom inside," Abby grumbled. She never liked it when her children were distressed. She would have some choice words to say to her brother-in-law when she saw him. How dare he cause her children such trauma? "Honey, it's all right." Jed pushed back the bolt, and the 3 children rushed into their arms. They were all screaming and chattering at the same time, and everyone's concentration was on them. Jed tried to ask the children where their uncle was, but they couldn't respond because they were weeping so hard. Well, Jeremiah entered the house. "I've checked the outhouse and barn, but Josiah isn't there. Maybe he went home." He couldn't have left the children alone. Tabby felt the need to defend her husband. Josiah would never do that. No one said he did, but perhaps he thought we're on the way and he was feeling poorly, Joshua said. "Why don't we go and find out if he's home? He didn't look too good when we left him, but he stubbornly insisted that he was all right." "Thank you," Tabby said. She'd wanted to stay behind with Josiah and help him with the children, but he had insisted on her accompanying the others to Kate's place. "Josiah can be really stubborn," she agreed. After bidding everyone good night, Jeremiah and Joshua first took Beth and his children home before accompanying Tabby to her house. The first thing that made her feel scared was seeing that none of the gas lamps had been lit. The house was shrouded in darkness, and she felt her heart beating. What if Josiah was seriously ill or worse? "Honey, are you home?" Tabby opened the door and rushed towards the bedroom because the living room was empty, just like they'd left it earlier in the day. Jeremiah busied himself lighting the gas lamps. "Honey, are you feeling poorly?" She came to a sudden stop when she opened the bedroom door. The room was in total darkness. "Jeremiah, please bring me one of the lamps." Sure, he brought it, and they entered the bedroom together. Everything was undisturbed. "Josiah doesn't seem to be here. Let's check in the other room." "Sure," Tabby said. Because of being restless at night, she thought that her husband might have decided to use their spare bedroom, but it, like the master bedroom, was empty. Joshua joined them when they returned to the living room. "I've checked all around the house, including the outhouse, but didn't see anyone or anything." "Where is my husband?" Tabby sat on the couch, twisting her hands nervously. What has happened to Josiah? Could he have gone to the bunkhouse? I don't know. Joshua responded to Jeremiah's question. Why don't you go and find out? I'm coming with you. Tabby stood up. I have to find my husband. But search as they did, they couldn't find Josiah anywhere, and no one had much sleep that night. For 2 days, the search for Josiah was done, and on the evening of the second day, Jed decided to bring in the deputy sheriff. My brother has been missing for 2 days, he said, when Deputy Gaines arrived. He was taking care of the children and locked them inside the house before he disappeared. Could someone have enticed him away for one reason or the other? I don't think so. Josiah wasn't well and wouldn't have left the little ones alone. Maybe he took medicine which disoriented him and he wandered off. But we should have found him by this time because we've searched every inch of this land. Chief Black Bear even gave us some trackers to see if he could have wandered off into the forest in his delirious state. Well, let me try and find out what could have happened to your brother, the deputy said, and Tabby couldn't hold back her tears. She was scared of sleeping at home alone, and Abby had convinced her to stay at the main house. Don't worry, Mrs. Josiah Rusher. We'll find your husband. Chapter 10. Where is my husband? Tabby wasn't eating, and everyone was really worried now. It was 3 days since she had last seen her husband, and she was sure something bad had happened to him. Everyone was now convinced that trouble had come to Josiah, forcing him to leave because he wasn't the kind of man to abandon the little children and wander off. Though he'd also been ill, it wasn't so bad that he could have lost his mental faculties and wandered off. They had searched everywhere, including inside the forest itself. She was so grateful to Chief Black Bear for dispatching trackers once again, but just like before, they came up empty. Where is my husband? She wept in Abby's arms. The other 5 women took turns sitting with her as the men searched for Josiah. What if he's lying somewhere badly injured and unable to take care of himself? What if he's dead? Tabby, take heart. Abby rubbed her shoulder gently. Wherever he is, Josiah is all right. I can't explain what could have happened to him, but he'll soon be home. Let's hold on to faith. The other day when we were at Kate's place, I listened to all of you and what you were saying. I've been feeling poorly, and the symptoms you mentioned finally made me realize that I'm pregnant. I was coming home to share the news with Josiah, but he's not here. How will I bring up a baby all alone? She sobbed. You won't have to, because your husband will be home to help. A cry was heard from outside, and Beth stood up. Let me check on those little ones. I think someone is hungry or wet. Maybe even both. Henry was sleeping in one of the bedrooms, so she had time to check on the other 3 children. You will come with us right now. Jacob stood over Amy, who had a hand to her mouth and was giggling. Dead or alive, he said, and they both collapsed into fits of laughter. The baby, Bibi called out, and they laughed some more. Beth ignored them at first, thinking that they were playing a new game that they had probably learned at Sunday school. Give me your hands, Josiah Rusher, Jacob told Amy, and she held her hands out. He tied them with a small string. I will have no trouble from you now. Beth sat up and paid attention. The children weren't enacting a Sunday school skit. The mention of her brother-in-law's name was what made her realize that Jacob probably knew what had happened to his uncle. She didn't want to frighten him and wished her own daughter could speak better so she could ask her what had happened. Jacob, where is your pa? In the barn, Aunt Beth. Why? Would you go and get him for me? Come, Amy Bibi. Let's go and get Pa. He raced off while the 2 toddlers waddled after him. Even though their legs were small, they moved very fast. Beth paced nervously on the porch, not wanting to let her sisters-in-law in the house know what was going on. Tabby was in a bad way, and giving her such information would only further distress her. Beth. Jed came up to her. John, Judah, Jonathan, Joshua, and Jeremiah were with him. "What's wrong? Jacob told me you wanted to see me." He was holding the hands of the two little girls while Jacob followed closely behind. "I hope there's no problem anywhere." "It's true. I asked Jacob to get you and your brothers, too. As her husband came up the porch, she ran to him. Jacob was playing with Amy, and I heard him mention Josiah's name." "Slow down, Beth. What is it?" "Remember 3 days ago when we went to Kate and John's place and left Josiah and the children?" "Yes." "Ask Jacob what he saw." "Why?" "Just ask him." She buried her face in Joshua's shoulder, and he held her close. Jed looked at his brothers questioningly, but they all shrugged. The 3 children had come up the porch, and Jed picked his son up. "Me up, me up, me up." Bibi raised her arms, and so did Amy. Joshua took his daughter while John picked Amy up. "Jacob, do you know where Uncle Josiah went?" Huh. He nodded, putting a dirty finger in his mouth, which his father took out. "Could you tell us where he is then?" "They took him, Pa." "Who took him?" "The men." "How many of them were there?" Jacob held 3 grubby fingers up. 3? "Yes, Pa." Jed kissed his son on the forehead and then put him down. "Go and play with Amy and Bibi, for I have to speak with your uncles and aunts." The family gathered in the living room, while Beth watched the children from the porch, but since the front door was open, she was also able to listen in and participate in the conversation. "I'm sorry, Tabby. In our ignorance, we never once thought to question the children who were here with Josiah. I naturally assumed that Josiah had walked away, leaving the children alone. It just never occurred to me that he could have been forcefully taken away. Would he just walk away without putting up a fight of some kind?" Tabby sobbed. "Where is my husband? Jed! What has happened to him?" "I remember something," Beth called out, standing in the doorway, and everyone turned to look at her. When Jacob and Amy were playing, he pretended to tie her hands with string, which means Josiah was handcuffed before being led away. He was restrained by those people, and we know that it had nothing to do with the sheriff's office, because Gaines was here and would have said something. He may be a lot of things, but Gaines is the most honest law enforcement officer that I've ever known. Tabby looked up sharply. "This sounds like my parents are behind all this." Her lips tightened. "I'm sure of it." "Why would they have Josiah arrested? I thought he told us that he dealt with the Avert issue. He was going to write to your parents and let them know where you are." "I told him not to, and with good reason. This is what I feared would have happened." "So if it wasn't Josiah who wrote to let your parents know that you're in Woodland, who did it?" "We'll never know, because there are many greedy people who like to take advantage of situations such as this one. Reading about a reward in the papers obviously whetted someone's appetite for dollars, and they informed my parents. But I'm going to Ridgeway right now, and they have to tell me what they want with my husband." She looked so fierce that the brothers didn't envy who would be on the receiving end of her ire. "You can't go alone, Tabby. The men will go with you." "All of them, Abby." She smiled through her tears and anger, imagining her parents' faces when confronted by 6 strapping men. For not the first time, she wished that her parents-in-law were still alive to see how fine their sons had turned out. Jacob and Jenny Rusher would have been so proud of their sons. It was Jed who answered her. 3 of us will go and the other 3 will stay here to make sure the family is safe. Chapter 11. Setting things right. Jed, Joshua, and Jeremiah had been elected to travel to Ridgeway with Tabby. They hadn't spoken much on the journey east because Tabby was lost in her own world, anxiety for her husband rendering her unable to do much else rather than weep. She was also feeling very tired and knew that her condition was responsible for that. They arrived in Ridgeway early on a Wednesday morning, and Tabby insisted that they first go to the police precinct to find out if Josiah was being held there. "How do you know he's being held in Ridgeway and not elsewhere?" Jed asked. "We have to start somewhere," she said, eager to find her husband. The officer manning the front desk at the station was winding up his shift, but was able to confirm that indeed a person by the name of Josiah Rusher was being held there. He'd been brought in about 7 days ago and was waiting to be charged. "Who brought the charges against my husband?" Tabby was so angry that she wanted to fly across the desk, but Jeremiah was close by and ready to restrain her if the need should arise. "That's not for me to say, Mom," the officer told her. "For more information about this particular prisoner, I suggest you wait for the captain." "When will he be in?" "If you return at around 10 o'clock, he'll be here." "Thank you." Tabby felt fatigue wash over her. She looked so forlorn that the officer felt sorry for her. "Ma'am, I wish I could help you, but my hands are tied. I'll be sure to leave a note for the captain indicating that you had come to search for your husband." After thanking the man again, they left the station, and Tabby was happy to note that the cab driver was still waiting for them. "Shouldn't we first book ourselves into a hotel?" Joshua asked. "No. My father's house has many rooms and Mama will find you a place to sleep." Jed looked troubled. He knew these Easterners and how they adhere to strict protocol when it came to having guests in their homes. One had to almost make an appointment before they could be invited into someone's home, unlike the West when all a person had to do was show up and the hosts would find them a place to stay. "Are you sure about that, Tabby? We don't want to impose, especially seeing as there's so many of us." "I need this, Jed," she said desperately. "My parents need to see that I'm safe and not kidnapped as they indicated in the advertisement. Please." The 3 men accepted her invitation, albeit reluctantly. She gave the driver the directions to her house. The driver, a middle-aged man, was looking at her keenly. "Aren't you?" Then he shook his head, muttering at how people often looked so much alike. "We're here now," Tabby announced after they had traveled for about 10 minutes. "This is our home," she said as the buggy turned into a very impressive driveway. From the expressions on their faces, Tabby could tell that her brothers-in-law were quite impressed when they saw her father's house. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed home until she saw the house where she had been born and grown up in. The driver stopped at the front door of the mansion and then nodded. "Isn't this Arthur Kidman's home?" "Thank you for your services." Ignoring his question, Tabby insisted on paying him and then turned to her brothers-in-law. "Welcome to my father's home." She started up the stairs and rang the bell. Marcus, their butler, opened the door and stood there staring at her as if he'd seen a ghost. "Marcus, your mouth is wide open." She laughed softly. She had missed everyone. "Are my parents up yet?" "I believe so," he spluttered and let them in. "Shall I get them?" "No. But if you could have Lucia prepare something for us to eat, that would be wonderful. We've traveled a long way and need nourishment." She was really tired and needed to sleep. Her mother was the first to come down, and when she saw Tabby, gave a small cry of joy. "Tabby, you're back." She hugged her, and Tabby closed her eyes for a moment, reveling in her mother's warm embrace. "We've been so worried about you." "Ma, I'm fine," she said through her tears. Any and all anger that she had felt towards her parents gone, at least for the moment. "Sorry to arrive without announcement." "Don't be silly," May laughed, but her eyes were filled with curiosity. "This is your home, and you have every right to be here." Mama, Tabby, moved out of her mother's arms. "These are my brothers-in-law, Jedediah, Joshua, and Jeremiah Rusher." She smiled at the three men. "This is my mother, Mrs. May Kidman." Tabby was surprised when her mother shook hands with them. It wasn't normal for May to do that. "Welcome to our home," and her smile was so warm that Tabby was puzzled. Hadn't her mother heard what she said? "We're so happy to welcome our sons-in-law to our home. My husband will be down shortly, but Marcus will get rooms ready for you in the meantime." "Ma, Jed wanted to check into a hotel. Tabby had to test the waters." "Nonsense. I'll have none of that." Arthur was pleasantly surprised and equally welcoming, and Tabby felt that something had happened to her parents in the time that she was away. Marcus took the men to the guest rooms to freshen up before breakfast, but Tabby needed to speak with her parents. She was also very hungry, but concern for Josiah made her unable to eat much. Her father was getting ready to go to his office, but she asked them about the notice they had placed in the papers and the reward they offered. "As you can see, I wasn't kidnapped by anybody, so why did you place the notice in the papers? The reward you offered has also brought us a lot of trouble." "Tabitha," her father had a frown on his face, "you told us you were going on a short holiday and didn't take any of the servants with you, not even Lucia. When nearly 4 months passed and we hadn't received any word from you, we got worried. I'm sorry if the notice created problems." "It did, and that's the reason we came. My husband, Josiah Rusher, is in jail, even as we speak." "What?" Her parents looked at each other, and she was unable to interpret the look they shared. "Why did you do it?" She served herself some beans and bacon, but found that her appetite had vanished, and she pushed the food around her plate. "You're not eating your food, Tabby," her mother said. "I'm hungry, yes, but also very anxious." "Tabby." "Not now, Mother." Tabby gave her mother an exasperated look. "I need to think about how I'm going to get my husband out of the jail you put him in." "Tabby, your father and I had nothing to do with your husband's arrest." "Then who did?" She didn't believe her mother for one moment. "Someone sent goons to California, and they arrested my sick husband, and now he's in jail and ailing. Josiah was on medication which he wasn't allowed to bring with him when he was arrested, and I fear for his life, Ma." She wiped the tears from her eyes. "If something happens to my husband, you'll never have any peace in your lives." "Tabby." "Don't talk to your mother like that." Her father had never raised his voice at her, and she had the grace to feel ashamed. "I'm sorry, Pa." She covered her face with her palms and wept. Her mother felt her distress and made a sound of comfort which she ignored. Someone had put the love of her life in danger, and she wasn't in any mood to be coddled. "Listen." She heard the concern in her father's voice. "We received a telegram from someone in Woodland calling himself Rafford somebody. He was the one who told us where you were and told us that you were married to some local farmer. Much as we wanted to come out there, we decided that you were old enough to make your own mistakes and live with them. So we let the matter rest." "Then who sent those goons to arrest Josiah?" "Unless," her mother held a finger up. "I remember Clement was here when we got the telegram, and he seemed really angry when he found out that you were married. All this time since you were away, Clement was convinced that you were sulking and would eventually return home and marry him. So you really had nothing to do with my husband being taken away from home? Oh, Tabby! Her mother came closer and took her hand, patting it lightly. We realized that in the past, we didn't listen to you or care about your feelings. Seeing you now makes us understand that you had to do what you had to do, and you're looking really well. Tabby smiled and hugged her mother. I missed you and Pa so much. But as you say, I had to do this, and I believe that in the past 4 months, I've grown up and understand things better. I really believe that. Pa, please get my husband released. Let's go down to the station and see what can be done. Were you able to see him while you were at the station? No. When we got there, they wouldn't let us in until the captain arrived, but they confirmed that Josiah was there. Though Tabby wanted to leave right away, her mother begged her to be patient. You need to freshen up, and I know Lucia will be happy to see you. Besides, your brothers-in-law need to take some nourishment too. Her mother, ever the perfect hostess, took over. Something struck her. Ma, what about the reward? What about it? Did anyone come forward to claim it? May shook her head, and her eyes told Tabby that her mother was speaking the truth. They weren't behind her husband's arrest, and she now had a strong suspicion that Clement was somehow involved in all this. Josiah woke up in darkness again. His cheeks were wet, and he was cold, so cold that he was shivering. The floor was wet from the water that had been poured on him to keep him awake so the police could question him. He had wept for his dreams and most of all for the fact that he would never see Tabby again. It was thinking of her and holding on to hope against hope that had kept him alive until now. But he could feel his strength ebbing away and didn't know for how long he was able to hold on. He had no idea how long he'd been in this cell because he kept drifting in and out of consciousness. From the moment the 3 goons had picked him up from Jed's house and put him on the train, he didn't recall much apart from being forced to eat from time to time. All he'd wanted to do was sleep because he was really ill. He'd left his medication behind, and his captors didn't bother about his health. All they wanted was to get the $5,000 reward money, and once they did, he was handed over to the police. His charges were read out to him while he was in a semi-conscious state, and he agreed to all of them because he just wanted to sleep. Arguing or trying to say that he was innocent would only have led to lengthy interrogations and maybe blows, which he didn't think he could have handled. So he had pleaded guilty to the charge of kidnapping Tabitha Kidman. Get up, Josiah Rusher. A mocking voice made him blink in the darkness. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but then he saw this silhouette of a man standing inside the cell. He hadn't even heard the cell door open, and the man deliberately had his back to the light, so Josiah couldn't see his face or make out who it was. It also didn't look like any of the prison guards, for he wasn't in uniform. Maybe another detective, he thought. Who are you? His voice was a whisper because his throat hurt. Someone had provided him with a meal which lay untouched on the tray at the side because his stomach was in no condition to take in anything. What do you want with me? You stepped on my toes and will now pay for doing so. Did you think I wouldn't find out that you were the hoodlum who kidnapped Tabby and took her away? Without being told much, Josiah knew that this was Clement, the man who Tabby had refused to marry. He sighed and closed his eyes, waiting for whatever would come. Get up. Josiah merely shrugged, turned over, and faced the wall. No one had hit him yet, but he was sure the man wanted to and braced himself for the blow. Besides, he was too tired to put up much of a fight. Do what you have to do or just go away, he said. After a few minutes, He heard the cell door open and shut again, and he closed his eyes and fell asleep. "My name is Arthur Kidman, and I have reason to believe that you're holding my son-in-law illegally. If you don't let him out this very instant, I'll make such a fuss that this station will be shut down for good, and all the officers here will spend time behind bars. Now, Captain, do I have to make my request again?" "I'm sorry I wasn't around when Mr. Rusher was brought in." Tabby saw that the captain was clearly shaken. When he wanted to be, her father could be really formidable. He hadn't come this far in business by being a pushover. "Don't you check up on your prisoners to find out their crimes?" I was made to understand that Josiah was a dangerous fugitive who'd been arrested somewhere in California by bounty hunters while on the run. "Do you know the identities of these bounty hunters, Captain?" "Yes, sir. We use their services from time to time." "I'm just sorry that I didn't do a thorough investigation, though. Just clear my son-in-law, because I understand at the time of his arrest, he wasn't well. If something happens to him, this department and your bounty hunters and whoever sent them will feel the full wrath of the law, the real one this time." Josiah felt himself lifted to his feet, but this time it was more gently, and then thought, "This is it. They're taking me to the judge to be charged and sentenced." Too weak to walk, he hung between them and expected that they would drag him like the first men had. Surprisingly, these ones actually took his weight, so he didn't have to use his legs at all. "Careful now," one of them said when they got to the main door. Barely able to raise his head to find out where they were taking him, he got glimpses of the other prisoners who were standing at the bars of their cells watching them, maybe pitying the poor fool who was going to his death. Somehow he was sure that he was never coming back here again. "Poor fellow," he heard someone say. "He looks half dead anyway. Where do you think they're taking him?" He didn't get to hear the response because he suddenly found himself in a brightly lit room, and he closed his eyes against the light. His bodyguards, if he could call them that, put him on a chair in an inner office. Someone tried to wipe his face, and they brought in a change of clothes. "We need to get you cleaned up," one of them said. "Don't bother if you're going to kill me. Just let me die in peace," he said and slumped. When he next woke up, he was in a hospital, and Tabby was seated on the bed holding his hand. "He's awake," she told someone, and soon his brothers came into view. "What happened to me?" he asked after everyone had hugged him and made a fuss over him. Tabby quickly filled him in. "When the police officer said you had become unconscious again, I wanted to tear them from limb to limb. But we got you here in time, and you've been out for 2 days now. How did you find me?" "Jacob led us to you, little brother. We think that kids don't pay attention to whatever is going on around them, but my son actually did. I owe that little man something really big." Chapter 12. Meeting the Parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Kidman, please accept my humble and sincere apologies for what I did." Josiah managed to sit up in bed. "It was never my intention to create a problem for you or for Tabby. I'm very sorry." Tabby saw the respect in her father's eyes and knew that what her husband had done was the right thing. He'd asked to speak with them and sent Jed to find them. "We're happy that you're all right after that terrible ordeal," Arthur said. "My wife and I would like you to stay with us for a couple of days after you get out of hospital so we can show you that we're quite hospitable people." "That won't be necessary," Josiah protested. "I have to get back home because of my business." "Oh, yes. Tabby tells us that you opened up a sawmill. The better reason for you to stay here for a few days so you can get some tips from your father-in-law. Josiah found himself liking Tabby's parents. He'd expected them to be some stern individuals, but found them warm and caring. You could use the holiday to recuperate. We'll take care of the business so you don't have to worry about a thing. Get to know your new parents and learn as much as you can about the trade and then some more. We'll see you when you get back. Thank you, Jed and all, for bringing my wife safely to me. Lucia, I was so happy to find that you're still here. Tabby hugged her maid, and they were both laughing and crying at the same time. I was worried that my parents would blame you for my disappearance. They hadn't had the time to talk much before because Tabby had been so worried about Josiah. Life wasn't the same without you, and I'm sure glad to see you back, Miss Tabby. It's Mrs. Rusher now, Lucia. Oh, my love, you finally found a good man? Yes, I did. His name is Josiah, and he's been ill, but is recuperating now. You'll get to meet him as soon as he comes home from the hospital. She took her maid's hand and pulled her to sit down with her. So, how have you been? I missed you, Mrs. Rusher. I missed you so much and so many times. I wanted to write and ask you to come to me in Woodland. Why didn't you? I would have walked there. They giggled together like little girls. I'm so happy to see that my little girl is all grown up now. And soon, she took Lucia's hand and placed it on her stomach. Oh, Miss Tabby, I'm so happy. And I will need you, Lucia. Please say you'll come with me to Woodland when Josiah and I go back. Do you even need to ask, Miss Tabby? I'll make sure that Clement pays for this, Arthur said angrily after they brought Josiah from hospital and had him settled in. The man went behind our backs even when we didn't ask him to take any action. See what trouble he has brought. Pa. Tabby moved from Josiah's side and went to sit beside her father. Please don't be angry. Josiah and I have talked it over and decided that since nothing bad really happened, we don't want to pursue the matter. Even if you won't, I will. No, Pa. Clement has done something foolish and will eventually pay for his actions. Besides, he's been set back $5,000, she giggled. I know that his business can't stand that strain, and his grandmother will give him no peace. Pa, the man has dug himself into a hole and will spend a lot of time trying to get out. Just let him be. Tabby, her mother, smiled through her tears. Joshua has been good for you. Ma, my husband's name is Josiah. May blushed and then laughed. Their names are so similar, but Josiah it is. I can see that he has influenced your life greatly. She turned to her son-in-law. Thank you for taking care of our little girl, who we now accept isn't little anymore. And thank you for allowing me to keep her, Josiah said, a shy smile on his face. Tabby could see that her parents liked her husband, and she was so happy. Chapter 13. Beautiful Paradise. 8 months later. Miss Tabby, you need to push. Lucia, I can't, Tabby sobbed. It hurts too much. It's only for a little while, and then you'll soon hold your babies in your hands and smile over them. Why did they have to both come at the same time? You have to ask the good Lord that, my dear. We women are partners with him in creation, and if he chooses to give you one at a time or 2 or even 3, what's that to you? Just accept it and rejoice. I know, Lucia. Tabby was half laughing, half crying. Josiah is so happy. Ooh. Yeah. That's a mighty big one, so take a deep breath and push, Miss Tabby. Just when she thought she was going to die, it was all over, and her twin sons were born. Oh, Miss Tabby, you're in trouble now. What? She sat up, wincing at the pain. Oh, mighty fine, lusty sons you got, Miss Tabby. Problem is that they're identical and telling them apart is going to be trouble. Tabby laughed happily. When can Josiah see his sons? You really love that man, Miss Tabby. I do, Lucia. He's such a wonderful man. Well, let me clean you and the babies up because I can hear your man breathing down on the other side of the door. If he does that anymore, the door will come down. Oh, Lucia, you're so funny. On the other side of the door, Josiah paced up and down, running a trembling hand through his hair. You'll wear the tiles out, little brother. Jed walked up to his brother and led him to a seat. Tabby and the little ones will be just fine. Lucia is in there with her and all is well. Thank you. Josiah couldn't sit still and was back on his feet again. I'm just so nervous about everything. When Tabby told me she was pregnant, I was so excited, and over the months as we anticipated the arrival of the babies, I didn't think about what it would entail. But now that they are finally here, I don't know if I'm ready for this. I understand, John said. I didn't know that twins ran in our family. See, Kate and I, we just had ours a few months ago, and it's been a race all through. I'm proud of you all. Jed looked around at his brothers. We've come a long way. They all turned when the door opened and Lucia walked out, a baby in each arm. There's 2 of them, and they're so beautiful. She held them out to Josiah, but he only glanced at them briefly, then entered the room where Tabby was dozing on the bed. My love, he whispered, kissing her forehead. Thank you for giving me such beautiful babies. Have you seen them? He shook his head. I wanted to see my beautiful wife first. You're so beautiful, Tabby, and I always ask myself how I got so blessed. I look all shabby and frayed. Not to me, my darling. He kissed her full on the lips. You touched my heart and my life, and I love you so much. I love you too. Lucia returned with the babies. Everyone has oohed and an ah-head over them, and I think it's time for the papa to finally meet his sons. Sons? He looked at Tabby in wonder. 2 at a go? Yes, my darling. The moment Lucia placed his sons in his arms, Josiah was so overwhelmed that he didn't realize he was crying until Tabby gently wiped his face. They are so handsome, but we have to figure out a way of telling them apart right from the start. Tabby giggled, feeling so happy and blessed. What about my parents? They're on the way here with John, Kate, and Mr. Langer, Josiah said. He couldn't believe that he was now a father and was actually holding his sons in his arms. Tabby's parents had arrived 2 days ago, and it so happened that Fred Langer was at the station at the time of their arrival, and since they were well acquainted, had insisted that they should stay at his house. Have you thought about names for them? Kate and John beat us to Perez and Sela, she said with a small laugh. What if we call them Jacob and Arthur after our fathers? What do you think, my love? I'd love that very much, Josiah said, placing the sleeping babies in the bassinet and walking over to the bed. He gathered his wife into his arms. I don't think I'll ever be happier than I am right at this moment, my darling. He kissed the top of her head. Tabitha Rusher Kidman, you're my dream come true. I'll never stop telling you and also showing you just how much I love you. This was more than she had ever hoped or dreamed of. It hadn't been an easy journey, but she would do it all over again just to be here. She was truly blessed, With a wonderful husband, beautiful babies, and a large family waiting in the next room to congratulate her, they had this new life to cherish and love. She had been given so much, Tabby thought gratefully. Out of disappointment and rejection had come great love, and she would never cease being thankful for it. The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.